Welcome back to the COWS Leadership and Culture Conference. My name's Lloyd Clark. I'm Director of Research at the COW, and it's my pleasure to preside over the afternoon session. I'd like to begin by wishing Major General Duncan Catswell for his recovery from COVID. The General was meant to have presented this morning, but he sends his apologies and wishes us well. This morning we enjoyed a series of excellent presentations and discussions. I'm sure that the points that were raised will resonate as much with everybody listening to the conference as they have done with the COW team. And I've little doubt that the stellar array of speakers that we have lined up for you this afternoon will prove equally stimulating. Our speakers are Kate-Richardson-Walsh, Lisa Smith, Major General James Martin, and Simon Sinek. As with this morning, each speaker will present for 20 minutes after a brief introduction from myself, and we will then end the session with a question and answer period. So please, throughout the session, do tap away, send in your chat, send in your questions. And although we can't ask each of the questions that you provide, all of the chat, all of the questions will be reviewed by the COW team, and they will inform us as we look at the conference analysis. So, to begin, our first speaker this afternoon, Kate Richardson-Walsh. Kate is an Olympic gold and bronze medal hockey player. She made her GB debut in 1999, became captain in 2003, and remarkably spent 13 years in that role until her retirement 13 years later. She is an ambassador for various women's sports, and she has won various awards, including an honorary doctorate from Durham University. She is one of Great Britain's great sporting stars, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce her to you all this afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. It's an absolute pleasure and honour to be with you all. Who doesn't need a bit of Beyonce on this drizzly day? But I'm here to share a little bit of our story, our journey, and hope that it will resonate with you. I'll certainly be delving deep into culture, looking at when our culture worked and when it didn't work, and why I think that was, and certainly that there'll be some aspects of challenge within that culture, how we supported challenge, how we developed our ability to challenge one another and ourselves, of course, and then looking at leadership, the awareness and self-awareness that was developed in every single athlete and member of staff in that squad, which enabled us really to do what you saw on that lovely video and stand on the top of that podium. So to kind of give it some kind of foundation, I suppose I have to take you back. So I played international hockey for 18 years, And the first 10 years were frustrating, to say the least. They were inconsistent. And we were not without hard work and good intent. And, you know, we had goals and we had mission statements and we had kind of those conversations. But to be quite honest with you, because of the time that we had together, that was limited. We were working and we were studying and we were training as international athletes around that. So weekends or taking time off. So the time that we had together was spent on the hockey pitch. You know, who's going to score, who's going to stop them from scoring, tactics, technique. Very little time really spent talking about culture, about who we wanted to be about. And that only really changed when we were awarded the London Olympic Games for 2012. And we knew after the Beijing Olympics, we were going to get a little bit of an increase in funding. And, you know, for myself, my first Olympics was Sydney. We were 8th out of 10 as the women's team. Athens, we didn't qualify as the women's team. And as a result, we lost 70% of our funding as a sport. Beijing, we were 6th out of 12. So you might say a little bit better, but realistically, we were still very far away. And then here it came. Here was the opportunity. And thankfully, we had a visionary coach who was our head coach at the time, Danny Kerry. And he understood by this point, he'd gone on a learning journey himself with his leadership. And he understood at this point that however much he might have liked to said, okay, this is the course of direction, get on board and come with or get off. He knew that he needed to get buy-in. He knew he needed to empower this group of women. And so we, for the very first time, sat and really talked about and discussed our culture. And it started with a meeting, I think it was February 2009, something like that. And he stood at the front of the room, 28 women in our squad at the time. And he asked us a very simple question. How do you want to be remembered? Brilliant question. Never been asked it before. I mean, I don't think I've heard it since. And we started to talk. We shared our hopes, our dreams. We absolutely talked about our fears. And there was a lot of fear in the room, you know, having been 8th and 6th and not even qualifying, you know, this was, you know, a hard conversation. And after some really good, heated conversation, we eventually established our vision for the London Olympic Games as gold. Really, really simple. Not that creative, but really important, because at the time, as I said, there was a lot of fear, and some of the women couldn't even say the words gold medal. They'd say, we want to stand on the podium, or we want to be the best we can be. But what does that really mean? And of course, we didn't all leave that room skipping, you know, merrily out to the hockey pitch, all thinking and believing that we were going to go and achieve that gold medal. But importantly, there was a critical mass of assigned leaders and non-assigned leaders within that team who did believe we had what it took in the programme, in the very first full-time programme that we'd ever been a part of, and in our coaches and then the experts we had around us and within us as a team. And we underpinned that with some pretty generic values, and nothing wrong with generic values, but the important thing that really came out of those kind of 3 years in the lead up to London Olympic Games was our behaviours. And this was the first time we got into that detail, into the behaviours, and we called them our gold medal standards. So, you know, every decision, every choice you have to make every single day, ask yourself, challenge yourself, would a gold medalist do that? And you kind of know, you know, would a gold medalist eat what you had for breakfast this morning? I think I'm good. I think I'm all right. I'm not trying to go and win a gold medal anymore. I think I'd be okay. If you're not sure, go and seek expert advice and make good choices. Challenge yourself first and foremost, and then and only then do you earn the right and the respect to challenge the people around you. And it created this, you know, highly competitive, 28 women, only 16 get selected to go to the Olympic Games. So highly competitive, but very supportive, challenging, fast-paced, energetic culture that was about everybody giving all of themselves every single day for the good of that team, knowing every day that we personally may never benefit. We may not make that 16 squad. And it's one of the proudest things I've ever been a part of. And I went to the London Olympics and we won an Olympic bronze medal. And, you know, some people might say, oh, you know, you failed. And yeah, on some level we did. You know, we went for gold. We went for it with everything that we had. But we left no stone unturned, and we could have done no more. And realistically, that is where we were at that time. We were third in the world. We'd been winning World Cup medals as England, European medals, Champions Trophy. We'd been consistently one of the top 3 teams in the world over that period in the lead up to London. And here we were with that Olympic bronze medal. And that for us was success. At that time, it was felt very successful. It was successful. Now, I would love to tell you now that we did some really good hot debriefs, cold debriefs, 360 reviews, and learned all the lessons and marched off to Rio and won this gold medal. Of course not. That would be far too short and snappy and simple. We had to change. And of course we have to change. If we stand still, we'll be overtaken. So we always, as Olympians and Paralympians, we know in that 4-year cycle, there's going to be some change. We knew there was going to be a change of coach, therefore change of culture, change of leadership style, change of leadership model, change of the way we played, system, style, new players, of course, coming in. It was perhaps a bit too much change. Perhaps we didn't manage that change particularly well. And over the course of about 18 months, it became quite an uncertain environment. And in that uncertainty, with, of course, the stress and the pressure of elite team high performance, people went into kind of self-preservation mode. And that either meant retreating, so, not being vulnerable, not sharing ourselves in any way, or retreating into small groups because that felt safer, kind of gathering and having some of those toxic conversations that we've all heard and we've all been a part of. All of us could see this kind of panning out, but none of us could grip it. And it was hugely challenging for every single member of that squad at that time for various different reasons. And it culminated with the England team going to the World Cup in 2014 and playing off for last place. So 11th, 12th playoff. Now, having been, as I said, World Cup medalists, Olympic medalists, one of the top 3 teams in the world, here we were at rock bottom, not just in terms of performance, but in emotionally, mentally, spiritually, in every sense. We were really struggling. I personally, I've been captain for, 11 years at that point, and I was really asking myself some of those big, weighty questions. Why am I here? Should I be here anymore? Is it time for me to go? What's my worth? What's my value? And I had no answers to any of those big questions. So I needed to, for my own mental health and well-being, just take a little bit of a step away. So I took a couple of months away, had to work my way back into the squad through the development squad, and I started seeing a therapist at that time at the Priory, which I'm very grateful that we had access to. I know how many people in this country are not that fortunate right now, and I feel very grateful. I started seeing a therapist at that point, and it was a game changer for me, and lots of my teammates were doing the same. We came together and we needed to heal. We needed to draw a line in the sand, and before that, get everything out. Nothing left unsaid. All the emotions, all the disagreements, all the points of friction, get it out. So we had an external facilitator come in and just do that, just get it all out. And it was messy and it's hard, but it was important because from that point on, we could start to rebuild the trust. Brené Brown, the researcher and sociologist, talks about trust being a glass jar between us. And every moment that we share, every interaction that we have, a pebble will get put in that jar. And over time, that trust is built up, the jar gets built up. Now I can break that trust with one smash of that glass jar. It empties. What we have to do from that point is start to rebuild it again from the ground up, moment to moment. All of those small moments of vulnerability, of sharing, of connection, build up the trust again. And that's exactly where we were at the end of 2014. So our old coach, Danny Kerry, came back, who'd led us to that famous bronze in London, and did exactly what he'd done with that group pre-London. At this time, he had a group of kind of 31 very angry, driven, ambitious women who absolutely wanted to turn this around, and were ready to hit this hard. And so the conversation this time around the vision was much greater than a tangible kind of gold medal, that very small amount of success. It was about a greater, what does success mean? What does winning mean? What does it mean to this group? And we needed to reflect our history, our past. We wanted to pay respect to that. We also wanted to kind of look to the future. What impact could we have on hockey, on women's sport, on society, on the communities that we belong to? And of course, it needed to be mindful. It needed to be about the here and now, because we had 18 months to turn this very leaky ship around. And so we established our vision as a whole group, all talking about, all buying into, all building our vision of be the difference, create history, inspire the future. I can tell you now I retired in 2016, but this is still very much my purpose. It means that much to me. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning, quite honestly. It's that deep in me, and I think it is deep in all of my teammates in different ways, but at the same level of depth of meaning. Now, of course, we needed to now not really have generic values because we had 18 months, as I said, and these things needed to be living, breathing, feeling, seeing every single member every single day. So we needed things that were in our words, our language, things that you'd hear as reference in the gym, on the hockey pitch, you know, in our quarterly reviews, in our player reviews, in every single way, in every single sense. So our values for Rio were, we are one team, we are winners, and be alive. And I mean, be alive is that mindfulness, is that, you know, I had the best job in the world, I would do it again in a heartbeat, but it was hard. My body hurt, my mind hurt, it was a grind. Particularly towards the end, 18 years, I was 36 in Rio, things were falling apart a bit in every way. And it was hard, but I needed to be there. I needed to be there, not just in body, I needed to be there, mind, body and soul, for myself, for my development, but also for my teammates. I owed that to them. We Are Winners was about really just talking about winning and failure, both sides of those coins, celebrating winning, finding ways to win in any given situation. Our gym sessions and our hockey pitch sessions were built around that concept of finding ways to win, whether that's as an individual or as a team or as a whole unit. And then We Are One Team was a very special one because we'd been anything but a team in those 18 months in the build up to this point. And so we needed to be explicit and get really into the detail about behaviourally, what were we expecting of ourselves and each other? And I'm going to read to you. So we established what we called our behaviour statements for each of those values. And I'm going to read to you now. So these are all of the squad's words for We Are One Team. We are one team. We respect each other. We accept differences. It's okay to listen. You don't always have to talk. We belong to one team. I've got your back and you've got mine. We stand in this bubble together. Belong now, belong forever. There is no bullshit and there are no excuses. I'm connected to you. We wear the same kit. We're tight. We talk to each other. We share with each other. We stamp out buyers early. Talk to me. Listen to me. We share the load. Together we have strength. We are one team. Ooh. And I get goosies when I read that out, and I can't tell you how many times I've read it out. Because I'm remembering moments, instances, conversations between players, a group of players and staff together. They lived and breathed in every single person. And I could tell you so many stories of each of those behaviours and how they're brought to life. This is the detail. This is the golden nugget. I think some research has been done that only 10 or 11% of organisations operationalise their values into behaviours. How many times have we seen beautiful values on a wall in an office or in a building or in a book or on some kit? But what does it mean? Can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you feel it? Are you about it every day? Are you driving it? Are you responsible for it? Are you holding yourself and each other account to it? Because this is it. I think one of my favourite quotes I've seen recently is by John Amici, who is an NBA basketballer. He's British and he's now just a phenomenal psychologist. If you've never heard of him, please check him out. He's absolutely worth your time and your energy. But he talks about culture being defined by the worst behaviour tolerated in yourself and in the people around you. And when I heard it, I was like, why hadn't I heard that 20 years ago? That would have really fast-tracked a lot of things. But it is about those behaviours. And so I am going to bring it to life with a story of challenge. Because what this did, we were building our own framework. We were setting our own boundaries. Therefore, we knew where we could push to. We knew what we were working within. We knew what was expected of ourselves and one another. And this challenge came to me in the gym. It was about 3 or 4 months out from Rio, and I was in the days when I could do wide arm chins. I was doing my chins with a weight belt on, and one of the players came quietly to me, just quietly to the side in my rest period, and she just said, "Okay, I think you can put a bit more weight on that weight belt." And I was had that very egotistical, emotive, thankfully internal reaction. My face probably said it all, but I was like, who does she think she is? Like, I've been here like 18 years. This is my 5th Olympic cycle. It's going to be my 4th Olympic Games. Like, how is she coming to me? This player had been in the squad 1 or 2 years, 2 years probably at that time. And, I was having this whole very emotional ego reaction. And she went away and she left me to get on with the rest of my session. And for every rest period I had, I thought about what she'd said, and it was hurting because it was true. And it was hitting me hard because it was crossing all of my values and principles, and it was crossing all of our values and behaviours as a squad. I still get emotional about it now. And it was the greatest gift she could have given me. So after I'd come to terms with the fact that, goodness me, she's right, I went over to her and thanked her. We had a brilliant conversation, and I asked her, with her permission, could I share it with the squad? And I shared it very openly, where I'd been mentally and emotionally. I had been coasting in some areas of my training, if I was really honest with myself, and I'd let myself slip. And what a teammate she had been to me, to be brave enough, because that's hard, to go to a superior. I was just a player the same as her, but to come to me and to challenge me in that way, but to think about the way she challenged me, think about the language, the timing of it, the tone of it, everything about that challenge was highly skilled. And it absolutely was off the back of the development of our culture. She was upholding our culture that day, and she was upholding me as her teammate and her leader. And you can hear how emotional that is in my voice, but that's how powerful culture can be. That's how powerful behaviours can be. That's how powerful challenge within that framework that you're working within can be, when it's very thought about, thought through, and it's been highly skilled in using the tools that we've developed as players within that squad. And in that way, she was leading me that day. She was absolutely leading me. And so leadership, in my opinion, is everybody. Everybody can lead. Leaders leave a trace. Leaders have impact on the people around them. Whether you like it or not, you are doing that every single day. And we were doing that every single day within the squad. So we all needed to lead, whether I voted in as captain of myself or voted in as the leadership group, everybody was leading. And great leaders, in my opinion, are visionary. They know kind of that sense of direction. They have that course of direction. They're able to communicate that course of direction very clearly. And they have that the energy and the charisma and the ability to bring people with them on that journey. I also think great leaders really know themselves inside out. From the inside out, they fully know themselves, and they have the empathy and care and understanding to want to have that same level of understanding about the people around them. And so that's what we spent our time on with our psychologists. We spent an awful amount of time looking about that managing of self, that managing of state, that understanding of self. And we did, we did the very kind of traditional team building. We went to the Marines for 3 days, which was, I'm going to say, horrific. I mean, it was one of the best things we did, but it was horrific. We had an improv comedian come in. We went to the Leadership Trust. We did those kind of team building things where you're taken out of your comfort zone. We did an awful lot of time just reflecting, having conversations with our teammates and with our coaches. And we looked at things like A game. How can I consistently put out my best performance? And that's going to fluctuate day to day, but on any given day, how can I be my best? What do I need to do mentally, physically, emotionally to prepare myself to go and deliver what I need to deliver? As I said, how am I managing state? As you've seen, I am an emotional being. And for the longest time, I hid those away. When I realized that actually my emotions were one of my greatest strengths and one of my biggest tools that I needed to tap into, but I needed absolutely to manage them. This was one of the most powerful things that I learned. What am I like on a good day? What am I like on a bad day? What are the triggers that push me and move me into doing a bad day? And can I be mindful and present enough to be conscious of those and to do something about those, be proactive and actually do more good days than bad? We also just looked at lots of different ways to get that interaction and understand each other in those moments as well. But I think one of the most powerful things we did was look at strengths and super strengths, we called them. Now, there's lots of research to support this, and I think the Gallup Foundation have probably got the biggest source of research, if you're interested in reading up on this, about strength-based coaching, strength-based leadership, how it motivates, inspires, you know, enables people to go that extra mile, do that extra effort, give more to the people around you, understand yourself. And so that's what we did. Now, we either didn't know our super strengths, or we certainly weren't prepared to say them out loud, which is mad. You know, we're the best 28 or 31 female hockey players in this country, and we're not prepared to say our super strengths out loud. However, if we were asked to stand up and tell you all the things we were working on, or the things that we didn't like about ourselves, oh yeah, they would come out super quick. And it should be the other way around. Of course, we need to know our development areas, and of course, we're always growing. But unless we know our strengths, how can we know our value, our worth, our role, our self-esteem? And of course, it changes and it adapts depending on the team and the environment that we are working within. But here in this environment, this team, we needed to absolutely be about shine our strengths as brightly as possible to enable ourselves to thrive, which in turn would help the team thrive. And I'm going to cop out entirely. I'm going to talk about my wife's super strength. So Helen is my wife, also played in the team for 18 years. She was the woman you saw in the video, taking the penalty from the penalty spot in the final against the Dutch in Rio in the Olympics. Now, Helen had her running penalty, so a kind of one-on-one penalty saved. But she's our penalty taker. So one of the other players was fouled, and Helen had to step up and take this penalty from the penalty spot. And if you've ever taken a penalty, or you've seen anybody take a penalty, and you've watched them, or you've taken that long, lonely walk to the penalty spot, when your legs suddenly start turning to lead and they feel very heavy, and your hockey stick now, you're holding it with foam fingers and they don't belong to you. And then your mind kicks in and starts playing tricks on you to say, oh, I wouldn't go down there, Kate. You missed when you went down there last time. And oh, the goalkeeper's big. Oh goodness, I wouldn't put it up there. She'll save that. And by the time you've got to the ball, you've talked yourself out of it. I have been there, and I've seen other athletes absolutely be there. You can see the cogs turning over, and it's hard. That pressure is hard. Helen, though, in this instance, is striding towards that ball. Her head is up, her shoulders are back, and she just looks like the epitome of confidence, and which blows my mind, by the way. And she said afterwards that she felt confident in that moment. And the reason she felt confident in that moment was because we'd done the work. I mean, she'd done the physical training, she'd done all the hours of training, of trying different things, getting the pressure. She'd done that, she'd done the psychological prep, but she also knew that this was her super strength. She knew her basic skills under pressure and fatigue were world class. They were exceptional. And she knew this. And this is what she had to do. You know, it's pressure. It's Olympic Games, Olympic final. It's a 5th Olympic cycle, 4th Olympic Games. She knows she's getting to the end of her career. She's kind of getting towards mid-30s. The pressure is there. Fatigue is very real at this point. It's our 8th game in 14 days. She partially tore her hamstring in the semi-final. She has got nothing left to give. This is it. And it's a basic skill. I'm underplaying this massively. But when you strip all of it away, when you take all of the other external elements away, it's about getting that hockey ball from that penalty spot into the corner of the goal as hard as you can. That's about as basic as it gets. I am underplaying it massively, but it is as about as basic as it gets. And so this is why she's holding herself with such confidence. But interestingly, in that moment when the pressure really came, she said the thing that really elevated her in that moment was the fact that we'd shared our super strengths within the team. She knew without any doubt that all of her teammates on the halfway line, all the penalty takers, Maddie Hinch, our goalkeeper, our reserves in the stands, even the players back home who hadn't been selected, she knew that we wouldn't have wanted anybody else taking that penalty but her. What a feeling. Whether she missed, whether she scored, we wouldn't have wanted anybody else taking that penalty but her. we all have that opportunity. Firstly, to know our own super strengths and to be able to shine them brightly as often as possible so that we can be our very best selves, because frankly, the world needs it. But then secondly, to know the strengths of the people around us, to create opportunities and platforms for them to deliver those super strengths as often and as regularly as possible. For the good of them, to see somebody else thrive is just a wonderful thing, but to also enable the team to thrive. And if we can bring all of these incredible strengths together, we will find multiple ways to win in any given situation, in any given scenario. And that knowledge absolutely helped us and was, you can talk about 1%ers or marginal gains or the difference at the very, very top. This, I believe, was one of our performance differences, was knowing our super strengths and knowing the super strengths of the people around us, so we could call on them at any given moment and know that they would be able to deliver them. And you can do this. You can do this in your work environments. You can do this in your family units, with your friendship groups. We all have super strengths, and we all need to see them as often as possible. And I think the other thing we got out of doing these exercises, of looking at our state, of looking at our emotional intelligence, of looking at our ability to really bring out our super strengths to the fore, to recreate our A game as regularly as possible, is we got to see our difference. And I'll be really frank with you, hockey in this country is very dominated by white, middle class, cisgendered, able-bodied people, heterosexual people, and as a result, we are the poorer for it. We are shutting ourselves off to vast swathes of difference, and the opportunity there is vast to be more creative, to be more innovative, to find lots of different ways to win, to have more fun, frankly. And that's something that I'm really passionate about doing something about now. The moment in that team, all that we could have was focus on, was the difference that we did have. And that was certainly personality difference, absolutely some differences in upbringing and some different points of view and values, of course, and some differences in sexuality. And there was just that need to be empathetic, to deeply care for one another, to support one another. And this does not mean we were best friends. I can't make this, all sound jolly, happy. We were not best friends. There were people and there were moments of friction in that group, but the trust and respect that we had for one another was unbreakable. And that was because of the moments of vulnerability that we shared. We were prepared to create safe spaces where people could be their whole full selves. And some people did that, absolutely embrace that fully, and were able to really freely give all of themselves and be all of themselves. And of course, for other people, that was much harder. And all of it is valid and all of it is fine. But we had to be understanding of that within that squad. And I think, again, that's something, and the opportunity I see for the future. We were just about starting to get there, to talk about mental health, to talk about our sexuality, to talk about, racism and homophobia and religion, to really talk about the experiences that we were having and how we were impacted and how it impacts the people around us and what we can personally do about it. Which takes me nicely back to kind of where I started in that the behaviours, going back to that John Amici quote, our culture is defined by the worst behaviour tolerated in ourselves and in one another. That is your culture. That is the marker of your culture. Be empowered to drive, have responsibility for, and be accountable for your vision. Own your values, weave them into your processes, into your habits, make them routines, make them live and breathe in every single person. And you do that through your behaviours. And in that way, every single person can lead. At every single level, you are a leader. You need to lead from within. Find who you are, the kind of leader that you want to be, the kind of leader that you can be. Have that level of self-awareness. Love it all, because you can only belong to a team, a group, another organisation if you belong to yourself, if you truly fully accept all of yourself wholly, the bits you love, the bits you like, the bits you don't like so much. Once we accept it all, then we can really start to get that awareness of ourselves, be the leader that we can be, and then really work hard at the empathy and understanding and the care for the people around us, to know their super strengths, to know how we can support them best, to be their best selves for them, but absolutely for the good of the team, the community, the society, whatever you're part of. I have had a lovely time chatting with you this afternoon. I will be coming back later to do the Q&A, but it's for now, that's it from me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Kate, thank you ever so much. Your passion, your inspiration, your good sense does you great credit, and we're all very grateful for you being here. So thank you so much. Thank you also for talking for the full 30 minutes rather than the 20 minutes I erroneously gave you a little earlier. All of our speakers will be speaking this afternoon, of course, for 30 minutes. Just a few points that I picked up on, perhaps we can take forward later on in discussion. Thank you also for reminding us that leadership is all about going on a journey. And that on that journey, you never stop learning, no matter what your rank, what your position. So very, very important. And I think that's really interesting. You going from player to coach. Be interesting to see, perhaps in questions, what that journey looks like in reality. You also talked about the influence of leaders and their role, not only in creating a culture, but also influencing their followers to contribute positively to the creation of a culture, which I think is a really important point as well. And I was also struck by your insights into what makes a high-performing team. I'm sure that many of us have been part of sporting outfits during our lives, not necessarily all in high-performing teams, I have to say. So that makes me perhaps think about what the relationship is between culture, leaders, and teams that are not high-performing, or indeed might have aspirations to be high-performing. And I'm sure that we can delve into those questions as well as many others during the course of the afternoon. But for now, thanks again, Kate. We'll speak again later. So on to speaker 2, Lisa Smith. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Lisa to the conference this afternoon. Lisa has over 18 years experience in industry and in consulting, and is currently a partner at Deloitte. She's also inclusion lead for the consultancy business and a member of the Ethnicity Council. A frequent speaker at conferences, and who's renowned for her passion in developing the next generation of global leaders. I'm sure her insights will be well received by the conference this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Smith.
I'm really inspired and really quite emotional, to be honest, from your talk, Kate. I think you saw me chatting you up in the chat box there, particularly as being an athlete and really understanding what this connectedness across teams are. And actually something that Simon Sinek often talks about, which is the faith in your team, which is like, how do you get things done when you actually don't know each other? And that is actually an ultimate form of not only just trust and vulnerability, but really just this newness that you have when you're coming in to work with teams. So thank you for that. I am super honored to be here today, and thank you for having me. I'm pretty much a military brat and grew up my whole life with many amazing men and women who decided to sacrifice themselves and also sacrifice their times to be able to serve the country, which I'm from, which is in the US, as you can probably tell. Today, I'm going to spend some time, hopefully with a load of energy, around some of the newer science and really some of the candidness of why leadership doesn't show up and how that really prevents us from getting things done in a really basic way and also in a really monumental way. Hopefully, when you come away from this as well, you'll see that Deloitte isn't just like a financial company. We are really disrupting, which is why you see this explosion of the green dot here. It actually is quite a cool thing they allowed us to do. You can see that little green dot that's up in our logo there. They allowed me to come up with a logo that really exploded that green dot because I thought it was quite sterile. I thought it did not represent kind of this fluent economy that we're now operating in, and it certainly was not inspiring to our team. So I get to come in and be quite a thorn and a splinter, and really kind of shake up what has been a traditional environment, and really talk about the importance of leadership in culture and how that actually shows up in a corporate partnership. So I'm going to start off with the video, and you'll hear some themes in there. What's really important is diversity. What's really important is honesty. Vulnerability, we talk about empathy, we talk about the ability to cultivate psychological safety. How do you actually get after a mission when you actually don't know who in the hell people are on the side of you sometimes? How do you actually get in the trenches and deliver on that mission without having this kind of finite way of thinking, which means that you can't really build uncertainty there. Now, there's so many cool things that I see in this video, and I hope that you see them as well. And I'm going to try to lift some of those out because I think it really starts to get down to the meat of, does this sort of leadership show up, and does it show up often, and does it show up relentlessly? And do we have that same sort of compassion and really are you really compelling yourself to get after the mission when you really don't understand what's ahead of you? So I've pulled together a bit of a definition. This is really my point of view, but it's inspired by Simon. It's also inspired by Brene Brown, who I both really subscribe to. And we really embed these into our work, even as we're working with many of you as you're transitioning from kind of military life into the civilian world. We really have this really big focus on how can we embed some of these military principles, particularly around leadership, and then how we've been additive to be able to refine those. So for us, we think about leadership in many different ways. The first one is we believe that leadership has empathy, it is with vulnerability, and it has a big focus on self-care. It is absolutely choosing to look out for the person who is on your left and on your right. And if you are not operating that way every day, you are not leading. It is absolutely not about yourself. It is taking care of others in your charge, not being in charge. Now, every day, I'm going to be really honest with you, even as I show up to work, and even as I'm working by my colleagues, even if I'm working with my peers and with my teams, if I think about leadership at every level of the organization, I do not see a hustle or this kind of relentless focus on, I got your back, I'm helping you to the right, I'm helping you to the left, even if that means your success over mine. When you think about really big, high-performing teams, you think about the precision in which they deliver, but the first thing they are self-critical. They're thinking about self first, and then they're thinking about the team before their individual accomplishments. And then they're thinking about what is their continuous training to be excellent. And there's many different examples you can think about doing that. But the question here is, if this is a people in leadership and culture conference, do we really actually know what leadership is defined? And do we know actually how to spot those behaviors on a day-to-day basis? And most importantly, can we call out any kind of anti-patterns to those behaviors, understanding how important leadership is? The next thing I'm going to focus on is culture. And this is probably one of my favorite ones too. I always introduce myself. You heard Lloyd talk about me as being a digital anthropologist. And so that means I get to be in the technology world. I'm a Black female. I'm in a very male-dominated industry. And we tend to lose the focus on the human. So we think about the task, the mission, the stuff, the structures, and we think about the people secondary, which is actually very counterintuitive, and it actually never makes sense to me. And so we talk about culture, and we use that word all the time, but I actually don't believe we know what culture really means. I think we all have our different definitions of it, but I think it's really important that when you're actually coming together as a team and you have leaders set in place, that you really start to understand just how do you get things done around here. So when we think about culture, there's a couple things that I want to share with you. So the first is there's this kind of socially infinite transmitted patterns of action and expression. So you got people reacting from what might be going on at home, how they were raised, maybe some of their ethnicity, what drives them from a gender perspective. So many different influences, particularly digital, which I'll come on here to in a second. But most importantly, what are these patterns that are actually driving culture? And do we actually even know how to thrive within them? Most of the time, it's based on individual beliefs, and it's too hard at scale and huge, huge constructs to really start to understand, well, is that your belief more important than my belief, and who's going to win? And so you get into these battles of ego, and it actually starts to destroy a bit of the culture. So it's really, really important to really start to understand as you're building teams, as you're starting to come together and form, as you're really trying to get after something, even if you don't know each other, how might you come to a common ground of being able to just dwell and be able to exist? And you're gonna have to be honest with yourself. That means not only bringing your whole selves, but it also understands how to meet with others that just might not be like you. And most importantly, being able to help them get their job done over what you have, hoping that they'll do the same in return. So I want to share this quote with you. I think it's probably one of my favorites, but it really starts to talk about, for me, when we're working with our clients, and I'm an athlete as well, you know, we tend to get on the field and you have these kind of like, you know, this is how many people are playing the game, and this is how we're going to win the game, and these are going to be all of the offense and defense strategies. Sometimes you win and sometimes you don't, but the problem is you actually never can predict or be certain about the outcome. You can only prepare yourself to actually mitigate some of that surprise of not winning, but you never can actually drive uncertainty. And when we're working with clients, what I find is that everybody wants the answer. They want me to be able to write it down, and then they want us to be able to say, this is when it's going to get done. And I'm not a magician, right? So I tell them that. That's what I tell my clients. We are not magicians. We're not clairvoyant, but we can do some really cool things to actually start to get you to get your head wrapped around this. So one thing I want to share with you is really what Edward T. O'Donnell talks about around history being the study of surprises, because the more we actually operate in this digital economy, the more kind of uncertainty we deal with, the more we actually will need to relax our thinking around needing to know everything now and being able to fluidly execute your way through. And that is going to absolutely be a new mindset hack for leadership. The leaders will not know it all. The leaders will not be able to command and control. The leaders will have the least amount of information. How might you then accelerate being able to execute on your mission with knowing very, very little information in the beginning? So this kind of definition here from Jim Collins around uncertainty is chronic, instability is permanent, disruption is common, and we can neither predict nor govern events. There will be no new normal. There will only be a continuous series of not normal episodes, defying prediction, unforeseen by most of us until they happen. And this is from Jim Collins' book, Beyond Entrepreneurship 2.0. But what I think is really, really cool about that is that actually is very comforting to me. My kind of normal bias, my personality trait, if you do business chemistry, I'm an innovator and then I'm a pioneer. I actually love to live on the edge of not knowing what the hell is going on. And I love to actually inspire my teams to figure out how to relax the edges and how to relax the constructs and try to relax the plans a bit to say, how might you just prepare yourself to mitigate as much surprise as possible, but how might you do that in a very fluid way? And that, I believe, is the new way that we're going to be operating in this new kind of digital economy. And I think that is now where I'm thinking about leadership and culture. How might you cultivate a culture of not knowing, of uncertainty? We believe, but we don't know. How might you actually lead vulnerably with that, where you don't have to pretend to know the truth and then drive a lot of waste into your organization, or actually become agitated with each other because everyone's not delivering the way you thought, the way your brain actually fills in the gap. When you don't know that you have the information, you then come onto these illusions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how digital anthropology starts to impact some of that. So when I'm working with a client, we have a clear mission. We know exactly what we're going to be helping them to do. What we don't have control of is their everyday experiences. And when I start to think about the effects of digital anthropology, so this is like the opposite of what we talk about. We talk about driving new digital technologies. We talk about being more connected. We talked about being more fluid, but we actually don't talk about the consequences on how humans actually just interact with each other. It's like the whole like get in the back of the Uber car and don't talk to me things. We've actually learned to disconnect the more that we've connected through digital technologies. And it's actually working against some of these kind of basic social norms that we need to have when teams are coming together forming. So you're actually competing for attention, and you're not really sure actually how to get the attention of those that you're working with. So if you think about digital anthropology, it's really more about what are these consequences on the human collective as we drive more digital through each of the ways that we're working. Now, one thing is a fact is that we consume 90% of the information we have through our eyes, okay? And if you continue to think about digital technologies that we're deploying, we actually try to extend our natural human behaviors or our natural human existence through things like a camera. So if you're reading things and you're absorbing information, there's going to be no way that you're able to process all of that because of how connected you are to other things. And if we're actually driving information through our eyes, how about thinking about the fact that from a neuroscience perspective, your eyes actually play tricks on your mind? Okay, so this is scientific, and this is where maybe I get a little geeky, but it's actually what we are dealing with every day. It's the obvious that's not so obvious. So when you're trying to get things done and you can't get someone's attention, and you're trying to figure out why are you talking past each other or why you're not inspiring because maybe you're not starting with the why, think about actually the ability of our eyes to interpret what might be going on and filling in the gap between our current experience. And that's what Melissa talks about here, which is our eyes sometimes trick our minds to be able to actually build our perceived reality. Now think about leaders. When leaders are starting to command and control, they're getting really uncomfortable. They actually are going to be held accountable to the outcomes. They can't get dozens and dozens of people to get after the mission. They have no idea what they're thinking. And so they believe if they hunker down and they get more stern and they provide more constraint, that they're actually going to drive more outcomes. And it's actually the opposite. It's because their brains are actually filling in their perceived reality, which is this threat of needing to win or lose, or needing to win, not to lose. And so they think that they're going to get more of that out of the organization. So I've been studying how might you then hack that? So I think as we've been working with our clients, and I've been working with many of our peers, and we've been doing loads of research in this area, that one new hack of leadership and culture is to actually start to build this culture of illusions. And that might sound counterintuitive, might sound quite odd, but if you really think about what I just shared with you, we are consuming 90% of the information we have through our eyes. You've just read that, most importantly, our eyes actually plays tricks on our mind. So when we see things, the gap from seeing things and it processing in your brain, you actually fill that in with what you believe the perceived reality, the realities are. When you're actually in a culture of chaos sometimes, or if you're in a culture of not trusting, and everyone's like on pins and needles because they're afraid to make a move, and maybe their leaders are like over excited and over agitated about not getting things done, or the opposite, which is you may have a leader that is completely aloof and not sure, and they should be probably more locked into the threat. It is because these illusions are actually at play and we don't really know how to contain them. So one big hack here is, what is the ability to see order in chaos? And that is really something that you've seen as COVID has shown up. I think people who actually are really good at being able to work in a high level of uncertainty, they actually know how to process order in the midst of chaos. But what it is it's actually the ability to be able to translate what your illusions are and be able to lead so that people actually feel certain, but they actually are no more certain than what they were before. And I'm going to take you through 4 of those that we're doing with our clients right now, and what I believe actually could help you as you're kind of forming your teams and working things out right in a really, really practical way. So a little bit of a car crash coming in before we go into that, which is back to being connected. If you understand how a device actually starts to impact your ability to connect with people and then be able to get things done, you'll actually really start to be able to influence how leaders are leading teams. And so we just did a study with one of our big clients. You would know them, they're a huge toy manufacturer. And we clocked how many times they were actually on their phone or how many times they were on their email when we were actually in the middle of a big quarterly business review planning session. And so over 70% of the time, they were actually not paying attention. And so we were able to actually say, when you think something's not getting done, when you actually think that you need to invest more, it's actually been because you haven't been paying attention because of how you've been connected. And I think just be really practical about when you are gathering people together, when you're really talking about different moods that are setting in within the team. Think about how many times people are actually disconnected from what you're saying. They're actually disconnected from your presence. They're actually disconnected from what you're saying. They've probably heard maybe a third of what you're saying. And so there's this whole concept of what has a connected device done to actually being able to pay attention to the fact that you may not be able to compete with attention. So how might you have a captive audience, particularly when you're getting a team to be able to mobilize? And those are some things we're doing with our team right now. I actually get the pleasure to lead about 140 practitioners based here out of London. And it's really, really important for me to actually build a culture where they know how to take care of the business, where I actually become secondary. But most importantly, we have quiet time where we come together and we thoughtfully plan so that we can create this common operating picture so that when they leave, I'm confident that they understand what the vision is. They're confident that I trust in them to be able to execute on it. But most importantly, we know that we've been able to disconnect to be able to get around that. And that might sound maybe not like the coolest thing to do, but it actually is just awareness to understand how you distract yourself from being able to execute could actually have further ripple effects, meaning also how your culture comes together because then your teams are not connecting. The other thing is the phenomenon of social media. So we do have this kind of everybody needs to be affirmed in real time versus how do you actually process information to make better decisions and then understand how to leverage the strengths on your teams. We're missing that because everyone's back to being able to say, okay, how I show up on Instagram, how my iPhone is bringing information to me, how can I actually tweet what I'm doing right now versus being focused on what I'm getting done right now. All of those things are more important than connecting with the team. And so then your culture becomes a bit of, I have devices that I'm connected to, but I'm also not really clear what we're getting done over and over again. And so these two things working against each other are really probably what we've identified are our biggest threats of being able to work alongside our client. So your ability to be able to disconnect from social media, not actually have your teams now feel that when they're executing work, that same affirmation that they're looking from, that social media has taught them, that they're actually getting that in the teams where leaders are really recognizing the skill sets of their teams and how they actually might need to execute or what other kind of training and skills they may need to get after their work. You now have a clear focus as you're working ahead. So two things that we get ready to execute on here on is what we call infinite delivery. Infinite delivery is an operating model that we basically deploy at Deloitte that we believe has built a new culture. This culture is basically, like we call it an underground vault. So it's basically a hackathon where we have many of our talent go underground and build propositions. They don't ask permission to get their work done. They use kind of insights that are happening out in the market or really what's happening with their teammates to be able to build these propositions, and then they just go deploy them. So it's actually the most autonomous way that we're executing with no structure around it, and we're actually getting our biggest results. So if you think about what does it mean to actually fluidly deliver, I think sometimes then as a leadership team, we're really constraining some of the innovation that we need to be able to be next generation. So our operating rhythm is really just meeting talent with talent, and leaders have actually they've been neutralized in this process. And that's really kind of a tough thing to really talk to leaders about because then they find, well, what's my new role? So we're taking our leaders on an unlearning journey, which is now my identity is less associated with power and it's more associated with influence. How can I take my vision and get things done through others? Basically is how it's said. Two ways that we do that. We believe that an infinite operating culture is built on these principles that Brene Brown talks about. So vulnerability, clarity of values, trust, and rising skills. If you are not seeing that, you're actually not probably building a culture that actually can live with a load of ambiguity, a culture that actually can just get after. They can get together with the team, get their arms around the team, figure out what their own game plan is going to be, come back and continuously learn and improve, tell you what the new play might be, and then you be able to get them those rising skills they need. What else do you need from me as a leader to get your job done? And then bring information back to me. So we believe leaders go first. We believe in psychological safety. So what are those hidden things that you need to know? I don't actually get to know what's on the minds of my teams. I actually don't also own their discretionary effort. So if I want my teams to go the extra yard for me, or if I really want to get into their minds and make sure that they're able to tell me the truth about what's going on, I certainly have to meet them where they are. I have to flatten out the hierarchy, and they can't see me as a superior. They have to see me as just another link in the bike chain that's spinning the cycle around, and I just have a different role than what they have. The other thing is leadership intent. It's really interesting how many times we're working with organizations and the teams actually have no idea what their job is or what they're there to get done. So it's really important to talk about what leadership intent means to the organization. I put a quote here from David Marquet and Turn the Ship Around. I saw that there was some chat in the chat box earlier about that. He does have some really good principles. I do agree with someone earlier that mentioned that, he was put in a difficult situation. I think one thing he was able to do really quickly, though, is to become self-aware that really creating more replicas of him. So having more yes men were not going to help him actually turn the ship around. And that is actually a really big thing to do as a leader, to say, actually, more of me is not good. If I'm going to do different, I need more different. And when we start to think about diversifying teams, having more gender balance in our teams, you actually need to understand what that means. It's not about just checking the box and saying, I have someone Black on my team or I have more females on my team. It's actually really thinking about what are those skill sets, what are those new superpowers they have, that because they were a female in a very male-dominated environment, they think differently. Their precision is perfect because they know they have less chances than everybody, right? They're able to listen because most of the time when they speak, they have one time to speak. So when they speak, they have to speak with impact. There's all of these other reasons why it's really important to diversify a team beyond just checking your diversity metrics. So it's really, really important to understand when you have a team, do they understand what the mission is? And then most importantly, do they have the technical competence to get it done? And it's your job as a leader to ensure that they have everything they need to get after that mission. The last thing I'm going to share here is back to the infinite illusion. So if we believe that the mind is consuming information through the eyes at 90% of the time, and that the mind also plays tricks on the mind because of the delay in being able to process information when it gets to your brain, and really your awareness as a leader at all levels of the organization of, do you actually have some of these biases that drives that into how you get along with your teammates or actually how you're leading others? It's important to really start to understand then what are these interventions that can help you start to hack against some of those behaviors that you have. And we talk about behaviors all the time. It absolutely will make or break an organization. It will absolutely make or break a team. And it will actually destroy the ability to be able to connect, not even just to get the thing done, but just so that people can actually start to build relationships across each other. So there's 4 illusions that I use when I'm working with our clients, and it's really based on those things I mentioned. So my clients are always on a device. I can't get their attention. I'm never going to be able to compete with their attention, but I can put constructs in place to get their focus. The other thing is I still have leaders that want to command and control. And so until they understand that they're outnumbered and that they need the mission, they need the critical mass on their side, they're going to continue to have suboptimal outcomes. And that's for anybody. That's not just in a corporate environment. That's any team that you're leading. That's in any kind of relationship you have. If you're not able to actually make yourself kind of decrease so that others can increase around you, and through that, you then build inspiration, then you're going to have a really tough time getting after those things you're trying to do. So the first thing is the illusion of being omniscient. So how do you just have the illusion of feeling like you know everything? And that's really important, but it's actually quite easy to do. You have people that are closest to the work every day. So the day that you walk away from work, it is the day that you become obsolete, and you really start to understand, how might I, as a leader, get up underneath my organization and inspire them to get their things done, not really kind of project the way I would have gotten it done when I was in their role. So I have a high level of intelligence when I am executing, because I go straight to those that are closest to the work and they tell me exactly what's going on and they tell me exactly how to try it, and I let them go. So we have a huge culture of experimentation and learning, because I can think of very few things that actually can fail that would have catastrophic environments. And if that's the case, then you do what David Marquet does. You then reserve those red buttons for yourself. But most importantly, you say why you need to reserve those red buttons for yourself. The second thing is the illusion of certainty. So we use something called objectives and key results. They're OKRs. They're very similar to the military when you talk about mission intent. So can you break down an intent to the ability to get it to the front line where everyone can execute on it? We use that in a way to express value for work. We also use it to say, look, we believe that this kind of investment or doing this body of work is important, but we actually don't know until we start delivering it. So we're going to actually express it in a hypothesis. So it's a hypothesis outcome. And that's why we believe you build a culture of the next best question. What are the next questions that you're asking in the organization as a leader? What's the next question that you're asking as a teammate that's going to help you get your job done every day? The third one is the illusion of alignment. So the ability to actually take a body of work and break it down and be able to string it together. We talk about that building a delivery assurance thread. To us, that builds an illusion of alignment. So if you can take work and be able to string it through many, and you're talented in the organization, you actually create an illusion that everyone is aligned, even though it is probably the most chaotic way of working. You have teams off working, you have teams off just on different missions, you have people that are actually bringing back different levels of information at different times. It actually is very disparate. But because you have aligned all that work together and you've been able to articulate what the outcome's going to be, you've created this illusion of alignment. And then the last one is illusion of speed. And this one is probably one of the biggest ones, because we used to, from like an old school consulting perspective, say, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the easy thing you go get done? And it actually doesn't move the needle. But if you really think about what are going to be the big bets in the market, or what's going to be the big value for the organization, you actually create an illusion of speed, because when you actually execute that thing, you've actually done something. And so that creates a bit of an illusion of speed. So hopefully those four things kind of work together. They're quite tangible. I like them because the word illusion sounds a little deceptive when you're talking about getting things done, but it actually is the neuroscience of how your brain works and the ability to actually fill in information with real things when you're really actually not quite certain. So I'm going to end on this quote. It's a bit of something that Simon, who's I think going to be coming up after me, really talked about. But to me, we talk about this in our culture probably once a week. And it is really important that myself as a leader, that I articulate things. So not that I just put them on the wall or a poster, or I just have, a cute little thing, screen on my laptop that says, I'm a great leader and this is what I do. The most important thing that I can do in the culture that I'm building with my teams is actually articulate my value, the value that I believe that they're bringing to the team, my trust in their ability to get things done, my commitment to their cause. That means I'm all in on whatever those rising skills they need to be able to get after their success. And then most importantly, that everyone in the team matters. And I have that discussion every week. It is the most important discussion that I have. And sometimes that discussion is had with tears, and sometimes that discussion is had with lots of smiles and beers. It just depends on what's going on. But the most important thing is, can you intimately get into your organization and authentically be able to show up so that your teams know that you have them, you have their back before you have your own. So I'm going to read this and then I'll hand it back over to Lloyd. So we call them leaders because they go first, because they take the risk before anybody else does, because they will choose to sacrifice so their people will be protected and taken care of. The natural response, and in my words, in a world of massive uncertainty, is that our people will in turn sacrifice for us and then lead in return, which is what we need. So thank you for your time today, and I'll turn it back over to you, Lloyd.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Lisa. that was a really thoughtful and sometimes quite intellectually challenging presentation that I think really helps to develop the debate. So thank you once again. You've sparked so many ideas in my own mind, and I'm just going to sort of pick out a few of them that might resonate with our audience today. Your words with regards to technology, that we are more connected, but also we are more disconnected. That I think really resonates, and it's very interesting with regards to the work that the CAL has been doing on the Army Leadership Doctrine, in which we try to promote this idea that, you know, good communication endures, no matter what the technological situation or the context. It's important that leaders communicate in the right way, at the right time, in the right place, and it's an art that demands constant attention. I was also struck by your thoughts about how an individual contributes to culture. In our organisations such as the Army, we're all part of a team, but we're also part of something that is much larger than ourselves. So, you know, what are the cultural reverberations of our actions and behaviours, our attitudes and approach? Again, that needs constant vigilance. And also, how do leaders connect the dots between the team, the organisation, and the institution? That might also be something that we could look at a little later. And you also emphasised the importance for us to be self-aware, to question how we perceive, but of course also how we are perceived. And I think that that's all very valuable. So thank you again, Lisa. We'll come back to you in the Q&A, and I'm sure there'll be many questions for you. Thanks very much. So to our third speaker this afternoon, I'm delighted to introduce Major General James Martin, commissioned into the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment in 1993. General Martin has commanded 1st Armoured Brigade, 16th Air Assault Brigade, and since October has been General Officer commanding the UK's 3rd Division. Over nearly 3 decades in the Army, the General has served in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He's also been decorated for his gallantry and distinguished service. He's an officer of vast experience, including an impressive array of command appointments, which makes his insight into British Army culture extremely valuable to us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, Major General James Martin.
Professor Lloyd, thank you very much indeed. And I must admit, I feel hugely humbled to be here, following on from those fantastic presentations from Kate and Lisa, and also knowing that Simon Sinek is around the corner. Hugely humbling for me, but also a great privilege to be here. So thank you very much for the opportunity. The challenge that Langley Sharp set me when he asked me to speak at this was to talk about the culture within the British Army, but also those specific organisations in the Army which I had served in, which Professor Lloyd has kindly outlined there, and discuss my wider experience with a view to how I have developed the view of culture over the years, as well as discuss the symbiotic relationship between a leader and the culture of an organisation, and the leader's role in maintaining it, enhancing it, evolving it. So hopefully I can do at least some of that. My intent, with your permission, is that I'm going to give some initial observations. I then want to talk in 3 areas. The first is to how culture is forged in the British Army. The second is that role of leadership in the British Army's culture and the organisations therein. And then the third, I think it would be remiss of me not to at least mention some of the potential current issues and context that British Army culture and military culture in the round is going through at the moment. So to start off with, I would say the British Army is fundamentally a trust-based organisation. And as a result, and there are degrees of this, of course, but as a result, it is inherently backwards looking for lots of good reasons. In the military, we take our cue for behaviours from our past, as well as our predictors for how people might act in the future from the past as well. And as a result, such a heavily trust-based organization as the Army, it possesses more inertia than most, I think it's fair to say. And so it's brilliant that we have fora like this, where we can have the humility in the military to learn from others. And business and sports commentators and comparisons are really, really important. But at the same time as saying that, I would state that some of those comparisons can't be direct ones. The military, and the Army in particular, have a unlimited liability, which is not necessarily reflected in other walks of life. So I do think that direct comparisons, very useful, but direct comparisons can be problematic if applied without reservation, which, you know, hopefully we can unpack as we go. In some ways, I would say not much. You could take a position that not much has changed in Army culture over the last 200 to 300 years. And I realize that could be a contentious statement. But I would contend that it's the context and the degree to which component aspects are adhered to that has changed more than the inherent culture itself. And to misappropriate that now widely understood and accepted description of conflict, the nature of conflict remains the same, its character changes over the time. And to some degree, it could be deemed a similar case with the British Army's culture. Its nature remains broadly consistent, its character evolves. And I've enjoyed having a think about what are the values and the ethos that a redcoat 200 years ago might have thought and undertaken to adhere to compared to a ranger of tomorrow under the new integrated review. And for those of you who are in there, and I'll try and keep my vernacular to a minimum, but for those of you who are in the military listening to this, you'll be aware that the values and standards of the British Army are very clear and espouses the tenets of courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. And I would argue that a redcoat of 200 years ago would have undeniably understood and thought to adhere to those values and standards, but in a different context, which I'll talk about in a moment. And whilst, of course, under the colours and in British uniforms, heinous things have been done, values and standards have been broken time immemorial. Actually, I would argue that the historical weight of evidence is that British soldiers tend to be broadly decent, humbling and self-effacing, courageous, stoical, definitely humorous, and disciplined and fair throughout the ages. That is not to say that they have an unimpeachable record, but it's just a point to make that I think some of the values and standards, the ethos and culture that we enjoy now in the British Army would be utterly recognizable to our forebears. What has changed is some of our talk about behaviors now and the context within which those behaviors are delivered. As you know, in the Army's values and standards, we talk about our behaviors being lawful, appropriate, and totally professional. So where are the differences now than a redcoat to a ranger might perceive? I think it's fair to say now soldiers of the British Army today are more free thinking. They're much happier to challenge authority, challenge poor behaviors. They're much more diverse in every sense of that word. They're socially much more conscious, and they're much more committed to equality in the full modern sense of the word. Those are my opening remarks, just a bit of context about British Army culture, which can be problematic when you compare it to others. So I'm going to start with the first of those three questions I said I'd answer, which is how a culture, how a military or British Army culture is forged or changed over time. And from my perspective, from my experience, it starts with purpose, a statement of the purpose, a statement of an idea. That is where you have to start. Your pilot light or your North Star, for want of a better phrase. And for the field army, the British Army in the field, our core purpose ultimately is warfighting. And for those of you who are of a military bent and inside the bubble, I would commend the latest Field Army CONEMP as an admirably clear and concise document and statement of our purpose. I won't go into the detail because of the classification of this fora, but I just commend it to those in the army. And as a hierarchy sitting underneath that field army, This division I'm currently serving in, the 3rd division, is known as the Warfighting Division. And to get to warfighting excellence, it executes and practices something called combined arms maneuver. And I said I'd keep the vernacular to a minimum. But for those who are not in the military, that effectively means exploiting all the disciplines within the army, engineers, infantry, artillery, etc., converging them in time and space. So ultimately you produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And some listening may think that's problematic with regards to purpose, because in the modern world, the Army's outputs are so multifarious. But I'll just leave you with this thought when it comes to purpose through a military prism. I was lucky enough, I had the privilege enough to serve on Operation Pitting, the recent British and multinational, but Pitting was the British aspect of the non-combatant evacuation operation from Kabul. And when I returned, the Chief of Joint Operations came to visit us very kindly, and he just asked, what was the basis of the brigade's success on the ground there? And this was 16 Air Assault Brigade conducting this operation on the ground. And I said, of course, in the first instance, it was our remarkably resilient and professional people. But I also said in the second instance, it was also our combined arms competence. So even if war fighting is your purpose, your unique selling point, as I think it is for us in the British Army, it doesn't mean that it can't be co-opted usefully for other outputs. All I will finish with saying when it comes to purpose is that without purpose, your culture will never be a positively decisive factor in any theory of change and transformation that you might have in a military organization. So that's part one. Point two is that once you've set that purpose, everything you do thereafter must be what I describe as story driven. It's really important as a leader or a follower or a combination of the two, like inevitably we all are, that we capture the imagination of those inside the organization. And again, thinking about my own experiences in 16 Air Assault Brigade, we set ourselves a challenge there to pass what I would describe as the Falklands test, with a nod looking back over our shoulder to our forebears. And the idea here was that, like our forebears of 40 years ago next year, you could put us on the good ship SS Canberra at a moment's notice, get us to sail 8,000 miles deep into the South Atlantic, disgorge us at the other ends, then march across East Falkland, fight a series of tactical battles in which the force would be victorious, and then deliver strategic success at the end of that particular adventure. And that was the story people took on in working out how they were going to deliver the here and now demands that were being placed upon them. And as an example, during a validation exercise, in this case, those in the Army, you'll know it well, exercise Wessex Storm at the end of 2020, so December 2020, the 2 para battle group was set that particular challenge. Multiple crossings of the Salisbury Plain training area in appalling weather, conducting various tactical activities. And I was delighted and gratified as I went round a particular miserable day, days without sleep for the boys and girls on the ground, with the rain coming in sideways, digging in defensive positions around Imber village at 2 o'clock in the morning, just asking people how they were bearing up. And the answer was, absolutely fine, sir, this is what we do. And I had a similar conversation and experience with those on 3 para on Exercise Joint Warrior more recently this year. And it was a continuation of that story that we had set out. The paratroopers had now this story of themselves. We are the UK's first responders. We wear the maroon beret. In the country's hour of need, we will be the first to stand on the ramp before anyone else, just like our forebears did. So I think story is essential. Context of that story is important. And in my new role here as GOC, General Officer Commanding of the 3rd United Kingdom Division, I've slightly adjusted that, and we now call it passing the Op Granby test. And for those of you not in the know, Op Granby was the UK operational name for our contribution to what later became known as the First Gulf War, where the ultimate United Nations Security Council resolution that made legal the retaking by force of Kuwait and the ousting of Saddam Hussein's armies was Resolution 678. That took place on the 29th of November. And by the 15th of January, military strikes were occurring and the ground force invasion had begun, which included the first, at that time, UK Armoured Division, only some 76 days after that resolution was passed. So in a new context, the message of readiness is the same, but the thing that resonates with our people, the example, the story, changes to fit the terrain. So both of those functions of readiness are in the fullest sense of the word, effectively distilled and framed so people in those organizations can best understand them. What I will say about stories and them dragging the purpose into the belief of an organization's people is that it's got to be an authentic story. British culture, all cultures, I guess, but British culture and British Army culture in particular is highly skeptical in many ways. And our soldiers, our men and women tend to sniff out inauthenticity in a moment's notice. Okay, so that was the second point about how I've seen culture forged or changed. The third, following on from that story-driven activity that I just spoke about, is belief. And belief is essential. It's linked to the story. And this is what gets you your institutional buy-in, to adhere to that culture and ethos that you think is so important. And back in 2003 going into 2004, I had the privilege of working in the US General McChrystal's forward headquarters in the Baghdad International Airport in Iraq. And I think even for civilians, I don't think General McChrystal needs much introduction. And he would often say, when he talked about belief, he would often say that commitment and buy-in were absolutely key. And he would amusingly say, when it comes to stakeholders in a bacon sandwich, it is only really the pig that is fully committed. Be that as it may, I would suggest that for us, we have to gain buy-in through believing and through belief. And we have to believe, if we're willing, as we must be in the British Army, to sacrifice ourselves for the greater good, that it is an existential issue at stake. And so I think importantly in the British Army, we have to be threat driven. And when I think back to my time in 1 Armoured Infantry Brigade, that belief in existentialism, that existential threat belief was posited by a sort of phraseology and understanding that our adversaries are always watching. And we used to ask our people the question, if you believe that your life so far has prepared you to take on adversaries whose daily life is probably posited in a hardship that is very rare in our Western liberal democracies, then you're likely mistaken. So you need to compensate it, your belief, you need to compensate it with a ruthless will to win, which you will need to hone and reinforce at every turn. And we took this idea around the corporals and the sergeants' messes, and the men and women of those organizations bought into this idea. And they were humble and honest enough to see the truth in it, see the threat and the risk, and want to pursue ways to offset and mitigate those threats and risks. Similarly, last year, again, back in 16 Air Assault Brigade, on what was known as Operation Solidarity in 2020, during which 300 members of the lead assault force of 16 Air Assault Brigade parachuted into Ukraine, just north of the line of control there above Crimea. It was the belief in a genuine threat that drove the behaviors of our people and helped them to raise their game and allow us to put in place strictures and provisions that without that would have been impossible. This in turn, through their behaviors and actions, impacted the audiences against which we had planned to have certain cognitive impacts. And I know there are lots of other examples where people have seen that happen, but it was the belief was what drove behaviors, excuse me. Okay, moving on to my fourth point about how culture is forged and changed in my experience in the British Army. I would say at some point, your culture needs to be linked to successful outcomes. And in some cases, you need to manufacture those successful outcomes deliberately in order to support the culture that you are trying to inculcate. I certainly think if you don't really believe that your culture and your ethos will or is making you more successful in your mission or objective, then I would argue it's probably wrong. In the first instance, your culture needs to precipitate high morale, and I mean that in the peculiarly military sense of the term, as high morale is the seed corn of high achievement. I've seen in some of the commentaries as we've gone through there this afternoon, the All Blacks example and people's appreciation of the book Legacy by James Kerr, of which, I am certainly a appreciator as well. Now, clearly that is a much quoted and emulated book, but I doubt it would be if the All Blacks weren't the most successful international rugby team in history in terms of win rate and a number of other metrics. That is not the same thing as saying that the moral component of an organization, or in this case of the British Army, is merely a function of success. And interestingly, my experience of 16 Air Assault Brigade is that the historical examples of Arnhem and Operation Market Garden, underpin great self-belief in how airborne forces conducted themselves, even though the operation and the strategic impact itself were by and by largely deemed as failures. And the final point I would make about how culture is forged or changed in the British Army is that whatever happens, you need to minimize the dissonance in the organization that is owning that culture, the say-do gap that we hear so much about. And looking at some of our issues today, of course, the British Army has its issues. If I had to say what was wrong when the Army has made its mistake, either institutionally or at an individual level, it's not that the ethos and values are wrong, it's simply, well, not simply, it's that they haven't been adhered to. Now, that can be a commentary on culture, but it can also be a grouping of, I suppose it could be a grouping of an ethos and a value and a set of standards that aren't necessarily recognized elsewhere and are in some cases higher than in society or other organizations. Whatever happens, I think the ethos must match the actions of its subscribers the majority of the time if you're to prevent that dissonance. Otherwise, you have dissonance, you have a say-do gap, your words and deeds don't match, and that is the quickest way to lose belief. Ultimately, if you need to adapt your culture to your purpose. If your culture sits too far from your purpose, you will fail. And in the Army, my experience is that the differences in culture actually are pretty subtle and nuanced, regardless of the caricature of the British Army of being, regimentally driven. I think they are nuanced rather than wholesale and substantive. And if I compare the ethos that underpinned our culture in 16 Air Assault Brigade, formerly known as the Pegasus ethos, and then I compare the culture that we attempted to create in 1 Armoured Infantry Brigade under strike experimentation, which had the strap line of the boldest measures are the safest. There were definitely differences in there, but they were conjoined and had much more in common than in separation, I would argue. Okay, so that is my initial take on how British Army, my experience of how British Army culture is forged or changed. I want to move now, if I may, to the role of the leader and leadership in culture. And the relationship between leadership and culture, as you've heard from many of the other speakers this afternoon and no doubt this morning, is a fundamental one. And the question must always be, what can you do as a leader? What responsibility do you have to the culture of your organization? And I would absolutely echo what has gone before, that this is not about a cult of personality. It is not about you as an individual or your character as a leader per se. It's about leadership in the round and what you do in that leadership role. It is absolutely not about a cult of personality, as I say. And it always worries me when one begins to see, peccadillos and specific characteristics of a individual character aped elsewhere throughout an organization, because A, it can only last as long as that individual is in the position of leadership, and B, it doesn't get to the fundamental aspect of leadership that I think is so important. So for me, simplicity is key. So while it's not exhaustive, I think leaders, as a minimum, need to do 3 or 4 things. The first is, and I've already covered it, they need to provide that purpose, whether that purpose is to fight and win wars, whether it's something else. And they need to develop a compelling narrative that is story-driven, what our USP is. I won't go into any more of that. Secondly, they need clarity, absolute clarity. I think organizations are polymorphous, so the messages need to resonate in lots of nooks and crannies and under a lot of different contexts and circumstances. You know, policy, directives, and orders abound, but ultimately we need to provide clarity to our people in simplistic as form as possible. As brigade commander out of 1 AI brigade back in 2020, given responsibility for training in Canada, I was frankly shocked at the number of training objectives and competencies we were expecting our people to master, internalize, and remember. We wanted to simplify things for the section or the platoon commander trying to do his best under trying and difficult and challenging circumstances. So we just gave them 3 questions to ask themselves when they were stood in front of the mirror, the shaving mirror, whatever it might be. And we just said, ask yourself what good looks like. And we just boiled it down to 3 things: a ruthless will to win, extreme ownership, i.e., have we done everything in our organic power to resolve or ameliorate a situation, giving ourselves back some agency, and total professionalism. And we meant total professionalism in the traditional classical Greek sense of it, being a master of our trade. My point is, I'm not asking people to buy into those 3 questions. I'm just saying that you can steer a culture and behaviors with a clear and simple set of messages and principles. And the final 2 things I think a leader must provide is example. Personal example is critical. Lead by example is an oft-used but oft-misunderstood concept, but a leader has to live the values you espouse. They have to close that say-do gap personally. And in so doing, they have to create a culture of trust, which then enables people to police themselves, quite frankly. And if a leader breaches his or her own ethos and direction and guidance, then that is a leadership fail. And of course, we're all human, so we make mistakes. When we make mistakes, we must own them. The final thing a leader must do is provide his people with agency. Cultures have to be organic, and people have to have the freedom to act and fulfill culture in their own way. This is where the Army's point about every individual feeling valued for who they are and ensuring we maximize each individual's talent is so critical. We might get quite good at something we do someone else's way, but we can only really be brilliant when we are able to bring our own, one's own unique talents and personality to bear. And I would argue, when I'm talking about this, control freaks are absolutely dangerous here. And I would say I have been one of those control freaks, and it's damaging at every level. And it gets more so the higher up the chain of command you progress. It stifles initiative, it retards growth, it diminishes our people's sense of worth and sense of themselves. Encouraging initiative, on the other hand, I've seen firsthand, encouraging diversity makes us more operationally effective, as long as we can harness it in the right way. So purpose, clarity, that buy-in to deliver the greater good. And in case people have misunderstood me, none of that agency is an excuse for indolence or indifference. So before I get into the final part, a little cautionary tale about how these things can go wrong. And I think these things can go wrong when our leadership sets the wrong example. This is really important. So by way of anecdotes, US Special Operations Command conducted a cultural study. It's open source, unclassified. You can look it up on Google, called the Comprehensive Review. And it was a comprehensive review of its culture and ethics. And it was published on the 23rd of January, 2020. And it was in response to a series of high-profile cases about US Special Forces incidents of abuse whilst they were campaigning in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it talked of a command climate of placing force employment and mission accomplishment above all else. which in turn allowed for incidents of misconduct and unethical behavior. So for my money, it starts with leadership. And by way of personal example, I have made this mistake myself, particularly when on operations, setting unbridled institutional enthusiasm, which occasionally has translated into institutional obsession. And in my case, it didn't luckily result in moral jeopardy, but it very much resulted in a physical risk to the force. And as leaders, we have to own that stuff. I think I'll just finish this section in just saying, we do as leaders need to understand what the nature in the British Army and the military, what is the nature of what we are asking? And for the classical scholars amongst you, you'll be aware that at the Temple of the Oracle of Delphi, above the door, it was simply inscribed with the imperative, know thyself. But I think equally important, we need to know the nature of the business you're in. And ultimately, it is incredibly difficult to line to walk, to give our soldiers the ultimate responsibility, i.e. of holding another person's lives in their hands, at the same time ensuring that they need to be tempered by control, discipline, and judgment, so that you walk this path and you remain within the spectrum of values and norms of society, that society that is elected to pay you. When we get it right, we can do boundless good. When we get it wrong, we can do untold damage. And as always, I will just finish this section with a thoughtful and provocative quote from Jordan Peterson, who says that a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man or woman who has that under voluntary control. I'm just going to finish off in the last couple of minutes just talking about current issues and contemporary behavioural contexts. And in the last 2 years in the British Army, in the military, we've had what are locally known as the Wigston Report, the Gray Report, and the Atherton Report. We have had incidents of institutional failure. We've had high-profile removals from posts. We can't shy away from this. We've had legacy investigations into deployed AOs, including in Kenya, and we've had plenty of examples of bad behaviour. Cultures and organisations that espouse or build them must be rigorously and iteratively scrutinised. No room for complacency, and the British Army is no exception. And we've got to do this for two very clear reasons. Morally, it is the right thing to do, and operationally, it makes us more effective. Having said that, we've got to do it in a balanced way, and a way which never forgets our purpose. Returning to first principles, which I spoke about at the beginning, we cannot afford to throw the baby out with the bathwater or damage our fighting power as a result of misguided acts. I think this would be a disservice to the society in whose name we purport to act when we make those adjustments or judgments. As the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, the first responsibility of government is to protect its people, and the armies which exactly reflect society cannot protect society. And another quote from General Mathis, again, I don't think he needs too much introduction. History presents many examples of militaries that forgot their purpose was to fight and win. So long as we live in an imperfect world, one containing enemies of democracy, we will need a military strictly committed to combat effectiveness. Our liberal democracy must be protected by a bodyguard of lethal warriors, organized, trained, and equipped to dominate in battle. As an overarching macro purpose to live by for an army, I think that is hard to top and a bit of a warning. Similarly, armies that no longer represent society in any meaningful way will make themselves extinct as a societal or organizational construct. And one only has to look at what happened to the Spartans to see the dangers there. If we no longer recognize the values of society we protect, then effectively in an army we become a self-licking lollipop. And in a volunteer context, no one will join the army either. That famous Latin phrase springs to mind, quis custodiet custodes, who guards the guardians. We must police ourselves and be prepared to be policed if we do not. So finally, as we look to the future, I see absolutely no dichotomy between doing the morally right thing and being the very best army we can be. Indeed, the very opposite. Diversity, inclusivity, fairness, and collaboration all lead to greater operational effectiveness. You can't have one without the other. Our people are the ones who are going to provide the solutions here. And I hope that doesn't sound like an abrogation of responsibility. We should ask them what we need to do. We should engage with them at every turn. And I think we should focus on being really, really effective by eschewing the temptation to virtue signal at every turn and avoiding establishing a veneer of change at the expense of real and meaningful change where it is required. And I will turn to that great protector of equality and diversity, Stephen Fry, to put this much more effectively than I ever could. And he wrote, he has been heard to state, and I paraphrase him, "My problem with those who pursue political correctness as a creed is that they are much more interested in being right than being effective. And we in the British Army must focus on being effective." My final point, and I will finish, is that actions definitely speak louder than words when it comes to creating the right culture. Momentum is essential. And we have to make our British Army culture a living habit. Certainly Aristotle said, excellence is then a habit. And for my money, how we do everything, how you or I, anyone does anything, is how you do everything. How we treat our people, how we pursue a fair and just culture where individuals are valued for who they are and their talent is maximized. Ultimately, that is the test of our professionalism and the test of whether our culture is right or not. And I 100% agree with many of the things that have been said this afternoon by my far more esteemed predecessors talking this afternoon. Ultimately, the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. Ladies and gentlemen, all, thank you very much for your patience. I'll bring my talk to a close now, but when we get to the panel, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Back to you, Professor Lloyd.
General, thank you ever so much for your thoughts and also your unnerving ability to cut through the complexities of British Army culture whilst not hiding from the challenges. It's really very, very useful. Being of the Army rather than in it, I sincerely believe that the institution should be very proud of its people. And of course, culture is ultimately about people. I'm constantly impressed by how the Army continues to drive high standards and to embrace change. But as you say, change endures, but we need to be careful, to use your phrase, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and not to undertake change for change's sake. And you raise so many important points about that. We have to recognize the value of what endures, as well as what needs to change to retain effectiveness and relevance. And that includes a sense of what motivates, what inspires, not just our peers, our colleagues, our comrades, our friends, but also those from different generations, those of different ranks, different backgrounds, those that are just different from us and in a variety of contexts. And I can see the questions coming through now about many of those subjects that you have pressed home. So thank you, General, once again for a really stimulating talk. Much appreciated. And so we move on to our final speaker of this afternoon, Simon Sinek. Simon is joining us from the United States, where he's a frequent and world-renowned speaker and author of several books. Many of you will undoubtedly have his works on your bookshelf, including Leaders Eat Last and Latiny, The Infinite Game. Simon's podcast, The Millennial Question, Are Leaders Born or Made, has had well over 150 million views, and his leadership training is highly sought after by corporate organizations, government departments, and many other sectors. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce to the conference Simon Sinek.
How are you? Good to see you. Well, I thought I would just spend a little bit of time sharing two thoughts, and then if you want, we can do some questions. It's really about the changing world order and the fact that we are still in a Cold War. And the question is the Western military organized for this new world order? Let me take a step aside first and tell you the basis of these ideas. In the mid-1980s, a philosopher and theologian by the name of Dr. James Carse defined these two terms, finite games and infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed upon objective. Football, cricket. There's always a beginning, middle, and an end. And if there's a winner, necessarily there have to be losers. I would argue conventional war fits this definition as well. Then you have infinite games. Infinite games are defined as known and unknown players, which means new players can join anytime and you don't necessarily know who all the players are. The rules are changeable, which means every player can play however they want. And the objective is to perpetuate the game, to stay in the game as long as possible. We are players in infinite games every day of our lives, whether we know it or not. There's no such thing as being number one in your marriage. Good luck with that. Nobody wins education. You can come in first for the time you're in school, the finite amount of time you're in school, where we agree upon the timeframes and we agree upon the metrics, grades. But nobody wins education. Nobody can be declared the winner of careers. There's no such thing as winning business. And there's definitely no such thing as winning global politics. But if we listen to the language of so many of our leaders, it becomes abundantly clear that they don't know the game that we're playing in. They talk about being number one or being the best or beating their competition. Based on what? Based upon what agreed upon objectives, metrics, and timeframes. I love talking to CEOs who are of high-performing companies, and they lean in and point to some metric and say, well, you know, Simon, we really are number one. And I always look back at them and say, for now. In the infinite game, there's no such thing as winning or losing. There's only ahead and behind, because the game never ends. But problems arise when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, when we play to win in a game that has no finish line. The consistent and predictable outcomes are the decline of trust, the decline of cooperation, and the decline of innovation. So now let's take a look at the world order. If you consider that the Cold War, Cold War 1.0, existed on three tensions. I should say, by the way, that there's no such thing as winning the Cold War. And I would argue that the West made one of the biggest single foreign policy blunders of the 20th century, especially the United States, when we announced that we had won the Cold War. No, we didn't. All that happened is that the Soviet Union ran out of the will and resources to stay in the game, and they dropped out of the game. And these are the currencies of the infinite game. It's will and resources, the will of the people and the money you have to keep playing. So like when a company goes bankrupt, you know, their competition doesn't declare victory. All it means is that players left the game, and the game of business continues with them or without them, and new players will emerge. Well, this is exactly what happened when in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. And as is the case of the United States imposed its will on the world without a balance of power, well-intentioned, mind you, but still imposed its will on the world. And as it turns out, the world didn't like it. They did things like declare no-fly zones over sovereign nations, which if there is a balance of power would never be able to happen. And what always happens in an infinite game is new players emerge. Like I said, if a company goes bankrupt, new companies will form. Well, that's exactly what happened. If you consider the Cold War existed on three tensions. There was a nuclear tension. The Soviet Union and the United States were the two most nuclear armed nations in the world, both capable of blowing each other completely off the planet. There's an ideological tension. The difference between the West and the Soviet Union is they both had ideologies and they were looking for customers. Democracy and capitalism on one side, and Soviet-style communism on the other side. And all of the alliances were based on our ideologies. If you were a communist, we weren't friends with you. And then finally, there was an economic tension. In the case of the United States, it was the United States and the Soviet Union with the two largest economies in the world. All those three tensions were conveniently co-located in a single place called the Soviet Union. So it made it very easy to recognize. Those three things are for any nation existential. If you go read the founding documents or the philosophies of any nation, you'll always find these three things. Something to do with life and the preservation of life or the protection of life, which is usually talked about in terms of strong military and things like that. Something ideological, and something economic. Because like I said, they are existential for any nation. And they were all conveniently co-located in a single place called the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell out of the game because they ran out of the will and resources to play, and eventually new players emerged, filling the nuclear tension. Many would argue North Korea, Iran, maybe Pakistan. The point is, it was now diffused. And though North Korea, for example, has the ability to cause damage in the case of the West, in the case of the United States, it is not capable of completely wiping off the planet. Number two, the Soviet-style communism, the ideology looking for customers, was replaced by religious extremism. It is an ideology looking for customers. And the third one, the economic tension, was largely replaced by China. We don't fear nuclear war with China, at least not yet. And some would argue that Russia is trying to assert itself and flirt with all three of those. But the point is that the Cold War is alive and well, but it is diffused across multiple tensions. It is not conveniently co-located in a single place. So for the West, and especially in the United States, we do not perceive that we are still in the Cold War, that Cold War 2.0 is here. There's a lot of infighting and bickering about where we should be putting our resources. Is it the Pacific? Is it China? Is it North Korea? The answer is yes, it's all of it. Is it religious extremism? We don't get to choose. It's all those things, because those things in total represent the existential threat. To make matters worse, the nature of warfare has dramatically changed, in large part due to the internet and computers, home computers. If you consider how innovation happens in the military, it is painfully slow and bureaucratic. If you consider how innovation happens in new emerging competitors, like with China, it is much quicker and much more efficient. And this is consistent with what we see as what I call sort of tech innovation. Let me explain how innovation usually happens in all circumstances. Consider that all innovation happens on an X and Y axis. On the vertical is performance, and the horizontal is time. And whether you're building a new product, whether you're building a new website, or whether you're pioneering a new weapon system, somebody has to write down a vision of what they're trying to build. In the military, we often call this requirements. But basically, it's a document that says, this is what we hope to build. And there it is, up there in the upper right-hand corner. And we start to build it. And it's sort of slow and step-like progress. And eventually when we build it, often late and over budget, but eventually when we build it, it never quite works exactly the way we imagined it. So now we spend all of our time and all of our money trying to fix it, trying to make it do the thing that we said it was going to do. That is traditionally how things happen. That is not how things happen in tech. The way things happen in tech is, yes, you still have to have that vision, but you don't attempt to actually build it. You say to yourself, what's the fastest, simplest thing we can do with the highest probability of success? And we build that. And then we say, what's the fastest, simplest thing we can do with the highest probability of success to improve upon it, or to take us one step closer to that vision? And you keep doing it with the highest probability of success. It's the fastest, simplest thing with the highest probability of success. And we make this step, and eventually we end up building something that is actually vastly better than what we imagined. So for example, think about how technology has happened in this modern tech world. The companies that deploy this are pretty new companies. Netflix only ever imagined being a DVD rental service. It never imagined becoming what it is today, where it's basically a studio. In other words, they had their imagined vision, which is what everybody has, but because of this this fastest, simplest thing with the highest probability of success, they were able to build the unimagined vision. Tesla only imagined building an electric car. Now you can put Tesla solar panels on your house and Tesla batteries in your house and power your entire house on Tesla. That was not part of the vision. Amazon only set out to be an online bookstore. Look what they've built today. Again, because they have an entirely different way of innovating, much faster and much more iterative. And if we look at the way that the West, especially the United States, iterates, we're deploying weapon systems that we imagined 30 years ago that don't quite work exactly the way we imagined, but now we're fixing them even though the vision is 30 years old. If you look at the way China, for example, is deploying, it's much, much faster. And the bureaucratic mess that is that we have makes us pretty poor competitors in Cold War 2.0, especially as we don't even realize that we're in it. So I will stop there and open up for any questions if you have any.
Very much, Simon. You've given us, again, a great deal to think about, the whole concept of an ideology and how we can translate that into an organization, the importance of vision and understanding the world and the context in which we're all operating is incredibly valuable to the discussion today. So thank you very much. Welcome back to the Q&A panel session. We've now got some time for our 4 afternoon speakers to respond to the questions that you have sent through. And thanks very much to the CAL team for assessing those questions and condensing them down. We've only got a certain amount of time, but hopefully we have created questions that represent the requirements of the many that have taken the time to respond to the question boxes. So the first one that we have here is about followership. Many of the speakers during the day, not just this afternoon, have mentioned that word followership, and they've said it's of equal importance as good leadership, but perhaps it's less well understood. And I wonder whether I can go to our speakers this afternoon. Let's start, please, with Simon, and to discuss how important you feel followership is in creating a positive culture, how important it is in teams, and have you got any personal experience of good or bad followership? Simon, over to you.
Every great leader is also a great follower. Great leaders don't see themselves at the tip of the pyramid. They see themselves as in service something bigger than themselves. Even the Pope reports to someone higher. As soon as a leader starts to see themselves as the thing that is followed, we have a problem. They are definitely leaders of the cause, but the cause is bigger than they are, and they see themselves in service. So great leaders are great followers. I think that sets the tone for everybody else in the organization. When you see your leader in service to something greater, deferring to the cause, deferring to the movement, deferring to the purpose, etc.
Excellent, thank you. Lisa, would you like to respond to that question?
I think it's very similar. I think when you have a leader that really kind of understands how to get the best out of the organization, then those leaders really actually extract what you never believed could happen. And I think that means getting outside of yourself. And I think until leaders really learn how to do that, you kind of sub-optimize the existence of the team and the people around you.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. It's quite interesting to note before we go on to Kate that the first iteration of the British Army Leadership Doctrine really underplayed the importance of followership, but the new iteration really has boosted at that and put it up front and central as being absolutely essential. Kate, can I go over to you now, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, our head coach, Danny Kerry, that kind of took us to that bronze and gold medal, and helped build those cultures that I spoke about, talked a lot about followership and leadership. And it was that understanding, exactly as Simon said, that it was at times, you will be leading, and at times you'll be following, and you need to do both with high skill, and you need to really invest in those skills and invest in yourself in those ways. And if I think to my as a captain, as a young captain, very egotistically, I thought I had to be all things to all people all the time, and of course fell flat on my face on a regular basis, because nobody can be that. And actually, it was about understanding that other people have great strengths around me, and unless I devolve leadership to them, unless I empower them, unless I lift them up, and in turn they lift me up, I'm not going to get anywhere, and the team's most certainly not going to get anywhere. And actually, I will need to follow them sometimes. So yeah, exactly as been said.
Thanks, Kate. General, can I go over to you now?
Yes, thank you, Lloyd. No, I've got very little to add, really. Concur with everything that's been said before. I'll just make a couple of points. The first is just to reiterate what Simon said. All good leaders are also good followers. And I think that is espoused by the motto of the crest that you're sitting underneath, serve to lead. I think that's absolutely crucial. The second is, you asked earlier about examples of bad or good followership. I mean, toxic followership exists just as much as toxic leadership exists. And examples of toxic followership would be where you're not happy with the setup or the leadership and the culture that's being espoused. You're utterly willing to undermine it, but you're not willing to add positively to the debate, or honestly bring it up in front of the leader about whom you're complaining. So I think toxic followership is equally an issue as toxic leadership. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We've got so many questions. I'm just going to move straight on. So apologies for no summaries, but let's move on to the next question. And the question here is, and I'll read it verbatim: in knowing thyself, is bottom-up feedback an imperative so as to improve how we lead and inform the cultural debate? Would anyone like to reflect on that? Please, if you raise your hand, otherwise I'll choose someone. General, you look as though you're making a move there. Thank you.
In a nutshell, absolutely. Bottom-up feedback. And it's interesting, the Army is 100% taking this to heart. So I think we will see some changes, if we're not already, see some changes in the very near future about ensuring we get 360-degree and certainly 180-degree feedback. But in knowing thyself and in understanding, the nature of oneself, I think it's quite hard to do it just intuitively. And yes, you can get better of it over time, but equally you can become more entrenched. And I would say, I mentioned toxic followership just now. I think the first symptom, or one of the early symptoms of toxic leadership, is a lack of self-awareness. So do I think it's absolutely essential that we get feedbacks from our subordinates from the lowest levels? 100%.
Great, thank you, General. Kate, I'm wondering, I mix quite a lot with professional sportsmen and women, and I believe that the tyrannical coach still exists, even though we might not like him or her to still have that place. In your experience, how do you get useful feedback to coaches, those that pick the team? And how do you do that in a way that is both sympathetic but makes a point?
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think it's for us in the team, there were definitely players who felt, the athletes who felt more able to have that upward challenge and have those hard conversations, possibly because they felt more safe in their position. Perhaps they'd been there for a longer period of time, or just there to kind of self-awareness and self-assuredness in the points that they were wanting to raise. And I think in our team environment, it's about establishing, who has that connection with that coach, and maybe it's about going through that person to have that conversation. But it was also about thinking about that feedback in any sense, whether you're talking up, down, across, whichever way. You're ultimately having a conversation and you are connecting with a person, and that person is another human being, and they have also got challenges, and ego and, you know, different personality traits and strengths and weaknesses, and they're also experiencing lots of things in their lives that you probably don't know about. And I think whenever we think about leadership feedback, I think it's just about thinking about having a conversation and building a connection. And actually, you know, giving feedback is helpful to the person you're giving it to. It's a gift, but it's also impactful for you to be thinking about feedback. To give that feedback, you are also growing and developing yourself at the same time. So when we talked about feedback, it was happening every day, all the time, in every direction, and we thought about it in that way.
Great, thanks, Kate. And Lisa, I wonder whether thinking about digital technology and that remoteness that inevitably leads to, does that make giving feedback more difficult? Because clearly it could be made easier by the technology, but again, doing it in the right way, in the right language, whilst not being able to read somebody's body language is potentially a real challenge.
Yeah, so I think there's a people element to this, and then I think there's that kind of, you know, traditional like process and technology piece. I think from a people element perspective, if we think about selfless leadership or ego-less leadership, we can't know it all sometimes when we have the vision, but we don't really know how we're going to execute on it, which is why it's really important to execute on outcomes. It's like, that's where we're going. How we get there, you sort it out. Sometimes we need that feedback to actually calibrate our thinking because we couldn't know it all. And I think sometimes when we get in the way of our own mission execution, it's when we think we know it all and then we're not open to that feedback. And I don't think that's actually what you're looking for when you're building that kind of culture. So how do you have this two-way dialogue where you're actually able to take the feedback that's necessary, but it's also the sentiment of your team, because I think ultimately that's what you're doing it for. And then I think from a technology, you know, I think as a technologist, it's kind of what Simon mentioned around this ability to iterate your way to innovation. You absolutely need feedback loops. When you think about end user feedback, over engineering is a lack of someone being on the other end saying, oh, that was good, or that's too much, or I didn't even need that, and you over invested in it. So I think there's something around what do you take, like those OKRs that I mentioned, that really is intended to be continuously refined. You only can continuously refine through delivery and feedback. And then you have people on the other end of that thing that's like, hey, this is good or this is not, or, you know, you can have some of those behaviors. And I tend to still feel like some of that stuff is exception based, but I think some of it is that leaders are not actually locked into frontline. So they actually don't know what's going on there. So I think that's my view on it.
Great, thank you. And Simon, the British Army recently has obviously been operating in multinational headquarters, and there are cultural challenges, perhaps, that one might discuss over the differences that individuals had from different nations in respect of, you know, what they may feel is a respectful form of challenge due to their background, their heritage and what have you. Could you give us any insight into perhaps how we might overcome some of those cultural challenges, cross-border challenges, if you will?
Two things come to mind. Number one is, if you're going to be working in a cross-cultural group, you should probably do just a little research on some of the norms of those groups, because they're all slightly different, and we can say things that accidentally offend or do things that accidentally offend, and vice versa. So I think a little bit of research, if you're going to be involved in those groups, that stuff is well documented. But the other one is listening. Regardless of what culture we come from, everybody wants to be seen, heard, and understood. Everybody wants to feel that they matter and that their work matters. I mean, that's a basic human need. And so I think an underappreciated and undertaught skill in most organizations, military and non-military, is listening, active listening, knowing how to say, tell me more, when knowing how to ask questions and actually care about the answers rather than just waiting for your turn to speak. That tends to overcome most cultural barriers.
Great, thank you, Simon. And I should just say to those that are viewing in, I know that you've got to leave us in a few minutes for another appointment. So thank you for your contributions. If all of a sudden your screen goes blank, that's the reason why. So to another question. It's about behaviors. To what extent do you believe selection for behaviors rather than competencies can improve leadership? And do you have any thoughts about how anyone might create a definable behavioral metric? That's a tricky one.
Well, I think this is a huge mistake we make in most organizations, which is we confuse competence for good leadership. Being a great player doesn't necessarily make you a great coach, and vice versa. There are bad players that make great coaches. There's no correlation between your ability to do the thing and lead other people to do that thing. I learned this from the Navy SEALs. When within the SEALs, there's a more elite group within the SEALs. And I asked, how do you choose who gets into that more elite group within the SEALs? And the director of training basically drew an XY axis. I'm big into XY axes today. Performance and trust were on the axis, performance and trust. Clearly, everybody wants the high performer of high trust on their team, and clearly nobody wants the low performer of low trust. What they learned is that the high performer of low trust is a toxic team member. And they would rather have a medium performer of high trust, sometimes even a low performer of high trust, it's a relative scale, over the high performer of low trust. And high performers of low trust often get promoted, and then they become toxic leaders. And very often leadership is aware of these people. And when we bring them to their attention and say, why haven't you gotten rid of this person? They say, well, their performance is so good. And ultimately, when you talk about an organization being trust-based or values-based, those are behavioral things. The great irony is it's actually very easy to identify low trust people. Go to any team and ask them who the asshole is, and they'll all point to the same person every time. Now, that does not mean that this person should immediately be dismissed. It means they should be coached. Just like when somebody's an underperformer, we give them additional training or additional coaching. And if somebody is unaware because they've never been given the feedback, passive aggressive doesn't help. Very often these people just get moved around an organization. Nobody actually just gives them the feedback. They have to be coached. The only time we remove them from the team is if they prove to be uncoachable for performance or behavior. But I think it's very easy to identify these people. Also, by the way, it's very easy to identify the other group, which is if you ask any team when the chips are down, who always has your back and who can you rely on to help you in the hardest of times, they will also all point to the same person, and that person may not be your best individual performer, but they're probably your best natural leader.
Thank you, Simon. Anybody else? Lisa, do you have anything to say on that subject?
I guess I would just only add maybe around, there's this thing called the influencer model, and it basically said it's, if you know the kind of motivations of a structure or an organization, you can get them to do what you need them to do. And, if I think about, my 25 years in the workforce, behaviors show up by either what people are being incentivized to do or the lack of, or some fear, there's some motivator in that. And it's perpetuated long enough that it actually just becomes the DNA of the organization. It's kind of like what we talked about before, like people are just walking by, your lowest common denominator is like the lowest behavior you tolerate, but sometimes those behaviors are incentivized. And so I think when we start to challenge, what are we really measuring our culture by? It's not the metrics, like Simon said, it's like, do you have a team? Are they going to look, are they doing something beyond themselves? Is there something big that they can rally around? So all kind of these tangible things that I think there's no value in a corporate structure and a team structure because you can't wrap your head around it. You can't measure it. So it's not valuable. And I think this is one thing you want to flip on your head and say, when behaviors show up, it's actually opposite of anything that you probably structurally write down on paper.
Thank you. General, anything to add there?
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd. I'd just say, I think when we talk about behaviors, vice competence, we're really talking about selecting people on their character. And from my perspective, character can be observed and measured in a certain way. And my experience of the most high performance teams is that character is best seen when people are put under duress and in testing situations and observed for long periods of time. Competence can be demonstrated and tested much more quickly. So there is a tension there in, if you really want to get to the bottom of people's behaviors, you have to look at them over a protracted period of time. And that is, of course, expensive, takes time, etc. But ultimately, I agree, you know, character is more important than competence. Once a certain level of competence has been, you know, reached, and if it's important enough, then we'll put in the time to work out what someone's character is.
Thank you. And Kate, from the sporting world, where it seems over the last generation, everything that can be measured seems to be measured. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Goodness me, yeah, you measure from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's a real test of how much you believe in the culture that you've created. Are you prepared to back it up and truly lean into the behaviours that you have shaped as part of your culture, and are prepared to have a hard line as to, you know, what isn't tolerated here, and even if that, you know, my world athlete is maybe technically very good, and people on the outside will say, you know, why aren't you selecting them? They're exceptional. But if they are not buying into and giving energy toward the culture and being part of, and being one of the drivers of that culture, then there is a really hard line there. And I think it's, you know, it's that bad apple. You know, you have to really think about energy cost, energy giving, energy taking, and what is ultimately the best for the team, and really ultimately the best for that person as well.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. I'm going to move again straight on to the next question. It's a big one, and it perhaps requires some individual definition by yourselves for certain words. But the question is quite simply, how do we change a culture that is institutionalized? Begs the question as to what we mean by we, but please take your own interpretation of that. Lisa, could I come to you first from that one, please?
Sure. Well, you know, I was just thinking, I work for Deloitte. It's quite a big global brand. And I think about, you know, how I'll just speak from my own experience. Here locally in the UK, which we're the largest member firm behind the US, we are quite institutionalized, meaning most people think of us as an accounting firm first, and consulting is actually our biggest business, which is our big people business. But the only way we started to kind of unearth some of this legacy culture was to change leaders. And those leaders needed some air cover. I'm sorry, no one is willing to trade off their, you know, capital prowess and their political, like, you have very few leaders that show up that bravely because they need something to fall back on. And so what we found is that where we found our most influential leaders and they could connect to the bottom of the organization, we were able to start to destroy some of these kind of systemic kind of habits and traditions and beliefs in the organization. But that leader needed to have enough air cover and enough kind of influence to be able to do that. And I'm just trying to be practical around how people operate. You know, people aren't, you know, we talked about today, like, how do you actually ensure your teammates' success? Most people are not wired to think that way. They're wired to think, I got to feed my family. I got a house to pay. I may have other investments, and they're thinking about how do they keep their income coming or their brand going, where actually some of that stuff needed to be traded off. And that's when we start to talk about the difference between an ally and an accomplice. And we like to use that word accomplice because that word is in the trenches. And I believe we have some accomplices now in our firm where people are actually saying, I actually have the political capital. I actually have the influence in the organization that can change these constructs, and it's not people who look like me that can do that. And until you actually get to those influencers, I believe, at least in the context of my business, you can't really start to transform these kind of, you know, institutionalized organizations.
Thank you, Lisa. Simon, over to you if you've any insight, please.
You know, governments, militaries, big companies, they're large, bureaucratic, slow-moving, highly political entities filled with bureaucrats. And my definition of a bureaucrat is someone who doesn't care. Like, that's the reason they follow the rules. It's because they don't care to go around them. We don't trust people to follow rules. We trust people to know when to break them. And so there is no changing the system. I mean, that would take decades and massive amounts of leadership and leaders who are willing to get fired and fail because that's how it works. But the way to do it is through entrepreneurial venture. And I've seen it done where you can take large bureaucratic, slow-moving, slow innovating organizations, but you create a breakout. And that those breakouts have to obey a couple of simple rules. So you can just pick a project or one platform or something that you're going to do differently. It needs to have a single point of accountability and authority, which means one person who can hire and fire whoever they want. They're responsible for the clearances, for example, so you don't have that mess. They can choose the vendors they want to use, so you don't have to go with those large incumbents that are also equally slow and bureaucratic. You need a single point of accountability. Number two, you need to be able to have co-located everybody. So you can't have these, distributed messes anymore where everybody gets to blame somebody else, but nobody gets to take accountability. So you put everybody who's involved, from the operator to the innovator, in the same space. So you can have that frontline soldier involved in the innovation with the engineer, for example, and they get to be in the same space so they can talk as they're building whatever they're building. They need to have the authority to make decisions. In other words, they're taken out of the chain of command and they report directly to whoever is the most senior thing. And they're literally treated like an entrepreneurial venture. And the people who lead these organizations, those single points of accountability and authority, if they're successful, it'll make their career. And if they're unsuccessful, it'll destroy their career. And by the way, they like those odds. Entrepreneurs like those odds. But the only way you can challenge it is by creating these little entrepreneurial ventures on the side. There is no changing the whole thing. But the point is, if it works, the tail can eventually wag the dog, and eventually, over time, it can shift the bureaucracy.
Great, thank you, Simon. Kate, anything from you, please?
No, I was just thinking, it's about, I think, listening, really listening, and pulling the veneer back, that shiny veneer that, big organizations love to, communicate outwardly, inwardly. Look at us, everything's great, we're moving quickly, we are the best at that. And actually, what if you just peel that shiny veneer back, you get to see the reality and the truth. So to listen to that, to see that, and to be honest with that view, to accept it, to fully accept it, the good, the bad, the really horrific, accept it all, and then act on it, and real act behaviors, processes, habits, real action. It can't just be a box ticking exercise. Real action has to be taken, and then learning and continuing that learning, and that learning can never ever stop. And I think I agree with Simon. There's some organizations are so big you just have to burn the whole thing down and just start again. But I think there is opportunity there, and it's hard and it's going to take time, but the shift starts with one person really being about the culture that they believe to be true, and being about the behaviors, and being prepared to challenge themselves and people around them. And I think that has a sparking positive impact and effect on people around you. And I think it's holding yourself accountable and being prepared to hold the people around you accountable as well.
Thanks, Kate. And General, before sort of allowing you to expand upon this larger question, I wonder whether I might just tweak the question slightly for you, to the point of, with the army growing its own leaders very largely, so in the context of perhaps having lateral entry in the corporate world, so very largely the army growing its own leaders, do you think that is an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to changing a culture?
Yeah, thank you. Well, before I answer that very specific question, I would certainly agree with what's gone before. And I said probably the single most important thing a leader can do to set the conditions for changing an institution is to protect the mavericks, to provide the freedom and the space for people who think differently to make the changes. Now, clearly you can set the tone at the top of an organization, but ultimately the thing that isn't going to encourage people to do things differently is when they see a maverick not only survive, but thrive as well. So providing people the space, providing space for the mavericks to do things differently, I think is hugely important as a leader. To your point, therefore, I think it absolutely makes sense for an organization like the army and the military to examine lateral entries. I'd have to give it more thought about how we might do that and into what roles, because when you're dealing with people's lives, there is a degree of competence which is very important for obvious reasons, but certainly not insurmountable. So as a proposition and as a point of principles, if I follow through and I'm being honest to myself about protecting the Mavericks, then lateral entry about people who think differently seems a logical conclusion.
Great, thank you, General, and thank you for being so candid with that answer. I think we'll now move on to the last question of the session. And again, this is a question that has been like many times on the system. If culture is defined as the worst behavior tolerated, how can you expand this out from tactical small team level to organizational level that applies across multiple teams? Let that sink in. Anyone like to kick us off on that one? Kate, could I ask you to respond? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is about having conversations again, because in any big organization there are many small teams, many small units, and they will have their own behaviors. They'll be bringing the values to life in their own personal way, but in organizations we can't work in this siloed way anymore. If we want to be agile and be able to be, to find different ways to win and to work in chaos, we need to be working across teams more often, more regularly. We're working in tribes, we're working with different groups, different communities. And I think then it is about, having conversations about what is accepted by this group, what isn't accepted. And so I know what the framework is and that we're working with, or build it, rebuild it. And these are just quick, snappy conversations. And it's also just flagging things when you see them. Don't let those tiny little toxic sparks, don't let them fizzle and bubble away, because little fires are being set up on a daily basis. And unless we are prepared to just talk about things when we see them, when we hear them, challenge consistently and constantly, are we then able to keep moving forward as these different integrated units? So I think for me, it's just about, again, it's conversation, it's connection, it's getting that level of understanding with one another, and keeping that going. That's how you keep the culture moving and driving forward as well at the same time, and it stops it from being stale, because it's a constant conversation.
Yeah, and if I may, sort of a secondary question to you, Kate. I mean, when you are sort of playing for your club with its own culture and then moving to England and the Great Britain team, quite clearly there's an amalgam of cultures and maybe even culture clashes. Was that something that your coach, yourself as a leader, and other maybe senior players spent a lot of time thinking about and dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, probably the most pertinent example for me is, coming into Great Britain with Scottish and Welsh athletes, and understanding that there are athletes coming in with their very strong cultures, very strong identities, and behaviours and everything else that comes with that. And it was really important to acknowledge that, to respect that, to understand that, and to give that space, but to also pull everyone into this new identity, this British identity, and not be, England centric, and to really force that home in every way. What is being put on social media, what kit are we wearing, what's the language used, all of those small tiny details just add up. In the behaviour statement, you hit one of the things that I read out was we wear the same kit. That's there because, yes, I play for England, but I'm here playing for Great Britain. And if I turn up with my England kit on, that is having impact on all the Scottish players, all the Welsh players, and that's not helping the team ultimately. And it can seem so trivial and meaningless, but it's each of those small things over time just layer up and cause huge amounts of friction. So can you put that, keep your identity with you wherever you take it, because it's part of you, but ultimately you're there for this team that you're then working within, and that must come first, in my opinion, my experience.
Great, thanks, Kate. And General, I would imagine that what Kate said resonates with you, having been a brigade commander and now the commander of a division. Just looking at your shoulder patch, developed by General Montgomery way back in the 1930s, and that desire to create a divisional identity, so very important, one culture, we're fighting together. I wonder whether your experience also proves the importance of creating one sort of dynamic culture amongst an organization.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's related to purpose, and it's related to the identity that, as I said, I think earlier, needs to be coherent with that purpose. Dissonance is the killer of an organization, an ethos, or a culture. So it has to be aligned and it has to be authentic. But I also think that growth in an identity also has to be organic. And therefore, between the constituent parts of any organization, whether it's a division, a brigade, a business, what the different departments in a business or a sports team, they have to be linked at a number of different levels. So the capillaries, the synapses between them need to be, and I'll use General McChrystal again, need to be connected in what effectively he described as a team of teams, whereby the organic growth and contagion of an idea and an identity happens incredibly quickly because of the complexity of the relationships between them. Different to complicated complexity, i.e. multifaceted, lots of synapses. So once you caught the imagination of one part of the organization and they see success and they believe in it, it's that contagion, flat and fast approach. But as I said earlier, it's got to be authentic.
General, thank you. And finally, Lisa, any reflections from you, please?
I love the team of teams chat, because I think that's right. If you think about the systems of work within a team or within an organization, we call that scaling by descaling, because, to what Kate talked about earlier, leaders show up at every level. And if you have a culture where everyone then feels like it is their accountability to enforce those behaviors and not a certain level of the organization, then you will get that acceleration. If you are still quite hierarchical and you think only those sorts of leaders are the ones accountable for driving cultural, then you won't get it. And I find in team of team cultures, because it is so autonomous, because at a scale, you need it to be autonomous, right? It's like you understand the vision and where you're going, but you need that autonomy to get the speed that you need to be able to deliver and execute. And so I think if we kind of take it back to leadership and say, if we can get leaders to show up at every level of the organization, then you can get that acceleration of scaling the culture that you're looking for. You can never get that if you keep it up at the small leadership level and then the masses of the organization.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to have to draw stumps on the session there. On behalf of the CAL and everybody listening in, thank you to our speakers this afternoon, Kate-Richardson-Walsh, Lisa Smith, General James Martin, and gentleman that has now left us, Simon Sinek. I've taken a lot of notes. I have learned so much this afternoon from you. I know how valuable your time is, and we are extremely grateful. So thank you very much. And I'd like now to hand over to Lieutenant Colonel Langley Sharp for his conclusion to the day.
Lloyd, thank you very much indeed. And unfortunately, time is against us, so we're going to have to draw the conference to a close. I'm going to struggle to give credit to a full summary of today's proceedings, given the breadth and depth of the discussion. But there are certain themes that have run through the whole of the session today, and I'd like to draw on some of those. Firstly, that leadership is a team sport. It's the ability to motivate and inspire teams to be better than your competitors. And I guess that's just as applicable in business as it is in the military. The importance of self-awareness. We've spoken about right at the beginning of the day from Professor Adrian, and is drawn out in the Q&A at the end of today. And that's certainly something that, as General James said, the Army is looking at and will be a key focus of attention for Project Bramall as we look at refining leader development in the Army. We're going to improve our leadership. As I said right at the beginning, we need to improve the development of our individual leaders, and that starts with self-awareness. As the Army Sergeant Major says, the criticality of bottom-up leadership. It's our junior leaders, those at the front line on the shop floor of our organisation, who are, if you like, the front of house and have sort of the direct leadership role for the vast majority of our organization, it's key for those individuals to define, shape, and maintain our culture. The need to reframe diversity, as Arwa spoke about today, to evolve particularly organizational diversity, not just because it's the right thing to do, because it's about developing performance and ultimately delivering operational success. And that communicating that rationale is absolutely critical and underpins the work that the Army organizational culture framework and the maturity model is all about, that Dr. Belissa Green spoke about earlier today. Also, the change challenge. How do we change our culture over time? And I was drawn to what General James was talking about in terms of referencing the nature and character of war, and the same analogy being applied to that of leadership and culture. Nature being more enduring, but the character of leadership and the character of our culture needing to change. And it goes back to my point right at the beginning of the day of the importance of the leader's role in this, in understanding what endures, what changes, and what evolves, all within the context of the purpose of your organization. The link between culture, leadership, and I'm glad followership was brought in there as well. That's something we've highlighted in the version 2 of the doctrine that was out recently, and that of behaviors. And I was drawn to Kate's reference to culture is defined as the worst behaviors tolerated. And finally, the fact, and this is certainly something that's been discussed throughout the day, that we are all on a journey. This is an evolving journey that we're all part of. It has no destination. It's a continuous journey. And as leaders, whether at the bottom of the organization or at the top of the organization, we all have a role to play. We all have responsibility, and we all must own that responsibility. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, as I say, it's been free for your attendance. I really appreciate how many people have joined us today. If you'd like to share your appreciation, please do so by making a small contribution to our chosen charity today, ABF, the Soldiers Charity. Every donation helps. No doubt some of you will not have been able to make the whole of today's session, the whole of the conference, and indeed you may have friends or colleagues who have not been able to attend at all, but the full session will be available on our YouTube channel not before next week. We will advertise that across our social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. If you want to understand more about British Army leadership and the CAL and our outputs, please do visit our website, Centre for Army Leadership. We also have a podcast series. We can't quite match Simon's reach, but we interview people from across many different sectors, not least the British military. And I should also mention a small book that's recently been published, The Habit of Excellence, Why British Army Leadership Works, which is very much a team effort from here, from the CAL. And finally, then, a few thank yous to our world-class panel of speakers for taking time out of their valuable program to be with us here today and share their insights and their experiences. Absolutely invaluable. To our chairs, this morning's session, Colonel Hannah Stoy, and lastly this afternoon, Professor Lloyd Clark, thank you very much. And of course, to the team behind the camera who have made this conference possible today. It really has been a team effort. I'd like to pay particular attention to Major Ben Acton and W1 Chris Nichol, who, although behind the camera, have been very much centre stage. And my final thanks as I hand over the reins of SO1 leadership here at the CAL to Henry Llewellyn-Usher, an individual far more capable than I, is a thanks to you, our friends and allies across the British Army, and indeed across many sectors that have supported the CAL over many years now, certainly during my tenure. May that relationship long continue, because it's vital for the mutual benefit of all our organisations as we continue to mature our leadership and indeed our culture. Thank you very much. Stay safe and goodbye.